Chapter 27 of The Mystery of the Hidden Room. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mystery of the Hidden Room by Marion HARVEY. Chapter 27 The Strong Box. After a luncheon, to which I did full justice, McKelvie flipped over the pages of the city directory and studied the section devoted to Cunninghams. "That's rather peculiar," he said. "He has no office in the city. If he is a lawyer, where does he conduct his practice? Something wrong somewhere. Come on, we'll get him at his apartments." We drove to 84th Street and inquired for Cunningham. "Mr. Cunningham? He's not at home," replied the switchboard operator in the hallway of the fashionable apartment house. "Do you mean that he is out of town?" asked McKelvie anxiously. "Oh, no. He'll be back at 5, I guess. That's the time he usually comes in when he's in the city," said the girl, bestowing a fetching smile upon my companion. McKelvie improved the acquaintance. He returned the smile. "Is he away very much?" "Yes, quite a bit." "Thank you, and you need not mention that I was asking about him. He might not like it," remarked McKelvie. "You said it. He's closer than a clam about himself," she returned with a little toss of her head. "Our friend Cunningham was once quite attentive in that quarter," explained McKelvie with a laugh as we drove away. "So much I learned when I first came here, and so I proceeded to make friends with Jane." "Where to?" I inquired, laughing. "Home?" "No, the Darwin Bank. I have a mind to see whether our lawyer friend, who has no office, possesses a sufficient capital to live on his income. Mr. Trenton is the best man to apply to, I guess, since I have already learned that Cunningham keeps an account at his bank." When we arrived at the bank, I sent my card in, and we were admitted at once to Mr. Trenton's private office. "What is it, Carlton?" he asked fearfully. "Good news," I replied, "which I should like you to convey to Ruth." I had ceased visiting her at her own request, and I told him Gilmore's story. Mr. Trenton beamed on McKelvie when I had finished the tale. "My dear sir, this is all your doing. How can I ever thank you? You have lifted a great load from my mind, and I can think of him with great pity now instead of horror in my heart." He bowed his head, and I was glad he did not know that Dick was alive. It was far better that he think his son drowned than that he know that Dick was somewhere in New York, afraid to come home. "Mr. Trenton," said McKelvie presently, "I came here primarily to obtain some information. Philip Darwin had an account here, did he not?" "Raines can tell you," Mr. Trenton replied, ringing for the head cashier. I nodded to the young man as he entered, for we were acquainted, and Mr. Trenton introduced him to McKelvie, adding, "And, Mr. Raines, you have my authority to tell Mr. McKelvie whatever he desires to know." "I'm at your service, Mr. McKelvie," responded Raines, with a cordial smile. "I wish to know whether Philip Darwin has a bank balance here, and if so, how much," said McKelvie, getting down to business at once. "He closed out his account on the 6th of October," replied Raines. "I'm not likely to forget it, since it was the very next night that he was murdered." "And the amount of his balance was," repeated McKelvie. $150,000. I gave him the money myself." "Did he take it in gold or notes?" asked McKelvie. "In bills of large denominations, so that it did not make such a very large package to carry. He put it into a small bag and took it away himself." McKelvie took a turn around the room and then asked abruptly, "Does a Mr. Herbert Cunningham, who lives on 84th Street, bank here?" "Yes. He's a red-whiskered chap, is he not?" McKelvie nodded. "Can you give the amount of his balance?" "I'll get it for you in just a moment." Raines left the room, and McKelvie continued to pace the floor. "What do you suppose Philip did with all that money?" asked Mr. Trenton. "That's what I'm going to find out," returned McKelvie. "I have an idea I know where it is." "According to Cunningham, Darwin lost it on Wall Street," I said. "Yes, and according to Orton, Darwin was a cautious speculator. I'll wager the secretary was the better judge of Darwin's character. Orton's shrewd, for all that he's a wretched creature. No, that money did not go into Wall Street, and I'm going to locate it in just a moment. Well?" as Raines came in again. "Cunningham's balance is $10,000, returned Raines. "Any increase lately?" asked McKelvie. "No, just a steady decrease," answered the cashier. "Has he a strong box?" "Yes, he has." "May I examine its contents?" inquired McKelvie. Raines looked at Mr. Trenton. "It's all right. I'll come along too," and Mr. Trenton rose. "By the way, Mr. Raines," said McKelvie, "I should like this investigation conducted as inconspicuously as possible. I'm a rich eccentric who wants to hire a strong box if anyone asks any questions." "All right, sir. Whatever Mr. Trenton says goes. I'll meet you downstairs with the key," replied Raines. Mr. Trenton conducted us through the bank corridor to the rear of the building and down a flight of stone steps to the entrance to the vault. The guard swung open the heavy door with a "Good afternoon, sir," to Mr. Trenton, and we entered the fireproof room where the safe deposit boxes were kept, and paused before the one marked "Cunningham." When Raines came in, he inserted the master key in the lock and opened the deposit box. Inside was a smaller tin cash box, and when he lifted the lid, for it was unlocked, we saw that it was crammed with bills. Raines's eyes opened wide with amazement, and if McKelvie hadn't caught the box, it would have fallen from his nerveless fingers. "Mr. McKelvie," he said in a strange voice, pointing to the contents of the box, "those are the bills I gave to Philip Darwin." "I thought as much," said McKelvie seriously. "Lock up this box again. Until we can prove that Cunningham has no right to the money, we cannot confiscate it. Thank you very much, Mr. Trenton, for your kindness in allowing me this privilege, and I'd be much obliged if you will say nothing to anyone about our discovery. You'll excuse us if we hurry along?" Mr. Trenton nodded, and we hastened out, leaving the president and the cashier to lock up the $150,000 in Cunningham's strong box. "So Cunningham has the money," I remarked as we drove toward Stuyvesant Square. "Can it be he murdered Darwin, and then helped himself to the bills? The cash box in the safe was found empty," I added. McKelvie smiled grimly. "Oh, no, he didn't steal the money. I don't believe it was ever in the house on Riverside Drive, but we will make our friend explain its presence in his strong box just the same. It should be an interesting account, to say the least," he ended sarcastically. "Call for me here at 5, and we'll hear what he has to say." I pondered McKelvie's meaning as I returned to the office. The explanation should be interesting, he had said. I agreed with him. Yet, after all, it could have no direct connection with the murder, since Philip Darwin had never taken the money home. But how did McKelvie know this latter fact? Was he merely theorizing, or did he know more than he had told me? He had not appeared surprised when we discovered that the lawyer had the money, for he had even hinted that he knew where it was. I determined to ask him what other information he had upon this point when I called for him at 5 o'clock, but at 4:30, as I was making ready to leave, he phoned me to postpone our visit. His voice was so high-pitched with excitement that my questions vanished from my mind as if by magic, and all I could exclaim was, "What is it? What has happened?" "Our friend Cunningham will have a pretty job on his hands explaining away all the facts I have gathered against him today," he exulted. "He's no more a lawyer than I am, Mr. Davies." "Not a lawyer?" I repeated. "No. He's not registered, and he cannot practice law in New York City. I'm going to look up one or two more details before we call upon him. Be at the house at 7:45, please, providing, of course, that you desire to accompany me." "McKelvie, if you dare go to 84th Street without me, there's going to be trouble between us," I warned, and he laughed gaily as he rang off. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Mystery of the Hidden Room. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mystery of the Hidden Room by Marion HARVEY. Chapter 28. Gold and Blue. Though I was impatient to interview Cunningham, it was almost 8:30 before we arrived at 84th Street, for on the way we had a blowout, and the garage attendant was the slowest specimen of his type that I had ever had the misfortune to encounter. Cunningham himself, debonair and genial as usual, admitted us into his apartment, and invited us into what he designated as his smoking room. It was a medium-sized room, furnished in good taste, and as I sank into the depths of a luxurious armchair and accepted the cigar he offered me, I felt assured that Cunningham would reasonably explain away the doubts which I had lately entertained toward him. Yes, the personality of the man and the soothing influence of that rare cigar had combined to make me as eager to hear him justify himself as before I had been anxious to prove him the murderer of his friend. But McKelvie was not so easily won over. He accepted a chair and a cigar, it is true, yet I knew well that he was waiting as a person does at chess for the next move of his adversary. "It is very pleasant to have you gentlemen call upon me," said Cunningham, breaking the silence. "Have you come in a friendly or an antagonistic spirit, Mr. McKelvie?" "I have come with an open mind," responded McKelvie quietly. "Explain yourself, please." Cunningham leaned back and puffed leisurely at his cigar. "In an investigation of the sort that I am conducting, one stumbles upon many queer things." McKelvie paused, to draw a long puff and to blow a series of rings toward the ceiling. "As these smoke rings cross and recross each other and finally merge together, so do the trails in this case cross and recross each other until they all come together in the final solution. To distinguish the truth from the myriad bypaths of coincidence and false testimony is quite an art, I assure you, for I do not believe in doing any man an injustice. Therefore, I have come here tonight to give you a chance to explain certain curious facts which have come to my knowledge." Cunningham bowed. "I thank you for the consideration, and I shall do my best to satisfy you." McKelvie laid aside his cigar. "Are you a lawyer, Mr. Cunningham?" he asked bluntly. If he thought to startle the man facing us so calmly, McKelvie was mistaken in his estimate of the lawyer's character. Cunningham removed his cigar from his mouth, contemplated its lighted end for a moment, and then replied simply, "I am not registered in New York, if that is what you mean." "Then may I ask you by what right you constituted yourself Mr. Darwin's lawyer, and acted as Mrs. Darwin's counsel at the inquest?" continued McKelvie imperturbably. Cunningham grinned sardonically. "I fancy that my estimate of the police coincides with yours, Mr. McKelvie," he said. "They got the idea, from Orton possibly, that I was Darwin's lawyer. They asked me to attend the inquest. I assumed the position they thrust upon me. What would you?" He shrugged whimsically. "It was no time to explain the complicated relation between us. As far as Mrs. Darwin is concerned, I did not advise her. In fact, I did not even see her until she entered the study." He paused, and then leaned forward and said pointedly, as he eyed McKelvie coolly, "You have asked me if I am a lawyer. Yes, I am in this way. I have studied law and was ready for my bar examinations when the death of an uncle in a foreign country left me wealthy. I had to go abroad to secure my inheritance, and when I returned I had no desire to restudy for those examinations. So you see I am a lawyer without a sheepskin, but nevertheless, Philip Darwin had more confidence in my judgment than in that of the men who legalized his affairs. I have given him legal advice, yes, as between friend and friend, because I was his confidant and he asked me for it. But I have never attempted to practice law in New York City or elsewhere. If you doubt my statement, you are at liberty to verify it." "I don't doubt you, Mr. Cunningham," responded McKelvie quietly. "I know you haven't practiced law. I was merely trying to get the connection between you and Darwin, since you know so many of his affairs, and represented him in a legal capacity when you went to Chicago to see Dick Trenton." A slight tremor of Cunningham's eyelids was the only indication that the shot had told, but he replied as coolly as ever, "Not in a legal capacity. He sent me because I was acquainted with the details of the affair, and understood merely that I was to find out how much real proof the boy had. What Darwin called me in his telegram I do not know, since I did not see it." "How do you know he sent a telegram?" queried McKelvie. "Is this the third degree, Mr. McKelvie?" asked Cunningham, frowning. "No, Mr. Cunningham. I know it sounds very much like it," apologized McKelvie, "but it isn't meant to be. You have shown a disposition to aid us before, and you will help me immensely by making certain matters clear. Will you answer a few more questions?" The frown cleared. "Certainly. Glad to assist you. Fire away," Cunningham returned indulgently. "And I don't mind saying that Darwin told me he had sent a telegram when he asked me to go out to Chicago for him." "What advice did you give Darwin when you returned from Chicago?" "I told him that the boy had a strong case, and advised him to write and request Dick himself to see Mrs. Darwin and arrange for the divorce. Whether he followed my advice or not, I don't know." "For your information, let me say that he did follow that advice, that young Trenton came to New York, and without apparent cause, committed suicide. Whether there was an interview between them or not, I cannot of course say positively," was McKelvie's astonishing reply. Why was he permitting Cunningham to remain in ignorance of our latest discovery concerning Richard Trenton? "I'm very sorry to hear this," murmured Cunningham. "I should hate to think that my advice had brought him to such an end." McKelvie changed the subject as abruptly as he had introduced it. "You said you had charge of Darwin's securities. What made you keep them?" His eyes on the other man's face. "He was a very peculiar man, and hated responsibility. I have cared for his securities and valuables for many years." "Are you also caring for the $150,000 that he drew from the bank, and that is now reposing in your strong box?" Cunningham looked annoyed, and then laughed cynically. "Nothing escapes you, does it?" he sneered, then in a different tone, "No, that money is mine. A year ago I loaned Darwin enough to cover a slump in the market, and thus saved him his fortune. I told him I was in no hurry for it, but as I've remarked more than once, he was peculiar. He came to me on the 6th and handed me the cash. I asked him what I should do with all that money in that shape, and told him I'd prefer a check. He said that I'd given him cash and he felt better returning it in kind, and so he left it. I was going to add it to my bank account, but I'm going on a trip shortly, and decided the cash would be useful to me. Therefore I put it in my strong box for safe keeping." "Thank you very much. Sorry to have disturbed you," said McKelvie, rising. "Answers satisfactory?" asked Cunningham with a wry smile. "Quite." "And how much nearer to the solution have I carried you?" Cunningham continued with great politeness. "Unfortunately, I have remained static. Your answers, though satisfactory as far as you yourself are concerned, have not helped me a particle toward solving my problem. I shall have to resort to desperate measures, I'm afraid," responded McKelvie, smiling rather oddly. "Desperate measures, eh? That sounds like business. Before you undertake this work, honor me by drinking to your ultimate success," returned Cunningham. "My man is away, so if you will pardon me a moment I will get the whiskey and soda." The moment Cunningham left the room, McKelvie, to my astonishment, sprang to the heavy portieres through which our host had passed and looked out. Then he drew back, and walking swiftly to a door at the side of the room, he opened it and darted within. Wondering what he was up to, I rose and followed him to this doorway and looked into the room beyond. To my surprise it was a bedroom, extravagantly but exquisitely furnished in gold and blue. A woman's boudoir, but I had no time to fix the details in my mind, for at this moment McKelvie came toward me hurriedly from his search of the dressing-table. With a final comprehensive glance and a whispered, "I thought I heard his step in the hall," McKelvie closed the door silently, while I retreated to my chair and sank into its comfortable depths, none too soon. With a clink of glasses, Cunningham entered through the portieres. He glanced at us rather suspiciously, I thought, but McKelvie was contemplating the ceiling as he puffed his discarded cigar, and I was deep in the pages of a book. What book, I have no idea. Cunningham set the tray he carried on the table and poured out the whiskey, allowing us to help ourselves to the soda. Then we raised our glasses and drank to the toast Cunningham had proposed, though I noticed that McKelvie merely touched his glass to his lips and set it down untasted. "I never drink whiskey," he said quietly, as Cunningham raised his brows in interrogation. "Is there anything else I can offer you?" "No, thank you. I appreciate your efforts in my behalf. Good night, Mr. Cunningham," and McKelvie bowed, a trifle too deeply to be really sincere. "Good night, Mr. McKelvie," responded Cunningham, returning the bow. Then he offered his hand to me. "Good night," he said again as we left. "What on earth were you doing in that bedroom?" I inquired as we parted at McKelvie's door. By the way, it was rather an odd room for a bachelor. "Did you remark the gold and blue? Rather a familiar combination, eh? Here's the true significance of that very charming room." Holding up his hand, he dangled before my eyes a tiny yellow satin sachet bag embroidered in blue, a satin sachet whose fragrance was the fragrance of Rose Jacqueminot. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Mystery of the Hidden Room. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mystery of the Hidden Room by Marion HARVEY. Chapter 29. The Reward. Cunningham and the fragrance of Rose Jacqueminot. Cunningham and a yellow satin sachet embroidered in blue. These words kept pounding in my brain, and though I went over them in the light of the facts which we had gleaned, I could see no plausible reason for Cunningham's having committed that murder. He could have no possible motive for wanting to harm Ruth, since he did not know her, nor could I believe, despite the gold and blue room, that he was in love with Cora Manning. He had evidently never called on her at Gramercy Park, or her landlady would have described him to us. And it was not likely that being engaged to Lee, Cora Manning would have received the advances of other men, at least so I judged from the manner in which Ruth had spoken of her. Cunningham's explanations, too, had been eminently satisfactory, and had cleared him even in McKelvie's eyes, as far as I could judge last night. Besides, it wasn't as though Cunningham were the sole possessor of one of those sachets. McKelvie was in much the same position as that robber in Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, of which I used to be fond in my childhood days, that robber who led his chief to the cross-marked house only to discover that all the neighboring houses were also cross-marked. As a clue, then, the fragrance of Rose Jacqueminot and the yellow satin sachet were as useless as the robber's chalk mark. It might also be that Cunningham's use of that particular fragrance, and his acquaintance with a woman who also affected yellow satin sachets embroidered in blue, was one of those coincidences that often occur in life, where truth is in many cases stranger than fiction. As McKelvie had truly remarked, the trails crossed and recrossed until the right one was lost to view in the labyrinth of paths. As I looked back over the facts we had learned, I was amazed to find how little real progress we had made toward the solution. It was all conjecture, and except for Dick's ring, we had no clues which could rightly be termed such. And when it came to suspects, Lee and Dick and Cunningham ran a close race, though the greatest amount of evidence pointed toward Dick, since McKelvie was inclined to hold Lee guiltless, and Cunningham had no adequate motive. About 2 o'clock McKelvie called at the office and found me alone. "Can you spare me a few minutes?" he inquired, as he glanced at the work on my desk. "I should say so," I returned quickly, pushing aside my papers. "Anything new?" "No, I've come to the end of my tether." "You don't mean that you're giving up the case?" I interrupted, dismayed. He laughed. "Giving up the case when it's just becoming exciting? You don't know me, Mr. Davies," he cried, and his voice was exultant, his eyes fairly dancing. "I was going to say that I have reached the point where skirmishing in the dark is no longer satisfactory. I'm coming out in the open, and I'm going to fight him with the plan of campaign spread out for him to read." You think that is wise?" "Yes, decidedly so. I'm going to let him know I'm after him, and then we'll watch him struggle to escape my net," he declared. "Then you know who the criminal is?" I asked. "No. I suspect, but I have no proof," he replied. "Ah, he's a clever devil, that fellow, and we're just beginning to break below the surface in this affair. Here's my scheme." He drew from his pocket a folded sheet, opened it, and handed it to me with the remark, "I've distributed copies of that around the city." I looked at the sheet, which still smelled strongly of the printer's ink, and saw that it was a handbill offering a reward of $1,000 for any authentic information which might lead to the discovery of the present whereabouts of Lee Darwin, last seen about 4 o'clock at the corner of 25th Street and 3rd Avenue on the afternoon of October the 8th. There followed a description of the young man, accompanied by his photograph, and the added announcement that the reward would be paid by Graydon McKelvie at No. Stuyvesant Square. "Ought to bring results, eh? When some 6,000,000 people become interested in finding him, we ought to locate him in short order." "What makes you think he is in New York?" I inquired. "Wilkins returned yesterday morning and reported that Lee never went south at all. There is no trace of his having gone there. So I started Wilkins at this end again. Last night, when I got back from Cunningham's, Wilkins was waiting for me. He had discovered that Lee had taken a taxi as far as 3rd Avenue and 25th Street. After that he vanished completely. So the presumption is that he is still in the city." "In the city and in hiding," I mused. "Yet you said the night we chased the criminal that in accusing Lee you were putting the true culprit off his guard by making him think you had no interest in him. That would imply Lee's innocence. Yet what other possible motive could he have for disappearing?" "There are two reasons for his disappearance, as far as I can see. One is the assumption that he is the criminal. This reason, as you remarked, I have discarded. Lee did not kill his uncle. I'll tell you why I make this assertion." He rose abruptly and took a turn around the room, then halted in front of me again. "You saw and heard him at the inquest. How did he impress you, as regards his character, I mean?" "He struck me as being a rather passionate, quick-tempered chap, one who also possessed the power of self-control. He has a frank face and clear eyes. Also, I've heard Mr. Trenton say in discussing him that he is a fine, upright boy, and that he liked him very much indeed," I replied. "Passionate and quick-tempered," repeated McKelvie. "Is he the type to commit murder in cold blood?" "No. In a moment of passionate anger, yes, but not in cold blood," I returned with conviction. "Just what I decided from the first, and as this murder was premeditated, that lets him out. Now for the second reason for his disappearance. He was engaged to Cora Manning, yet he denied knowing her. When the coroner showed him the handkerchief, he was in mortal dread that he would recognize it as hers. Therefore he knew something of what took place in the study, in which Miss Manning was involved. Or perhaps he knew of her intended visit to the Darwin home. However that may be, he knew something of importance. He left the inquest before all the evidence was brought in, therefore he was in ignorance of the verdict when he returned to the club. Nevertheless, he was a menace to the criminal's plans to implicate Mrs. Darwin, for Lee would have come forward and tell what he knew the moment he learned of Mrs. Darwin's predicament. What does the criminal do then? He decoys Lee from the club with a telegram, and keeps him a prisoner somewhere in the city to prevent him from giving evidence." "What a fiend the man must be!" I exclaimed. "But how did he know so quickly that Lee was a menace to him? The papers were hardly out by that time," I added. "Because he was at the inquest, and he deduced danger to himself from Lee's actions," replied McKelvie. "That is, of course, he must have been there to act so promptly, since he has no confederate, I am sure. There were any number of extra persons in the room. He could easily form one of the curious, or disguise himself as a reporter, or any other character that happened to occur to him. He is daring enough to have impersonated the district attorney himself." I agreed. "But in that event, when the man realizes you are after Lee because you need his evidence, for of course he will see your reward, won't he murder the boy to get rid of him? He seems to be capable of any outrage." "Unfortunately, that is a risk I shall have to run. Now that I am persuaded that the criminal is holding Lee a prisoner, I've got to rescue him, since the murderer is not likely to hamper himself with the boy overlong, if he hasn't done away with him already. We have wasted much valuable time following a false lead. Well, it can't be helped now, and there is nothing to be gained by crying over spilt milk. Wilkins is combing the east side, and I hope to have news in a few hours. From now on it's a fight to the finish," he ended exultantly. "I have shown the criminal my hand. I want Lee, and the man I'm ultimately going to get will do his best to balk me, if he can." "Here's to our side," I said, catching his enthusiasm. "And remember that I want to be in on anything that happens." "Right. I won't forget you." But he did, for I heard nothing further from him during the remainder of the afternoon, which I spent in an endeavor to pin my mind to market quotations which I considered merely trivial beside the problem that was worrying me, and when I called his house that evening, Dinah reported that he had gone out, and she had no idea when he would return. Disappointedly I sought my favorite chair and my pipe, offering Mr. Trenton a cigar, which he declined. He had been to see Ruth that afternoon, and as usual after such a visit he was very disheartened. I tried to cheer him, but with little success, since my feelings coincided so accurately with his own, and I could ill bear the thought of Ruth in that dreadful place day after day, with no hope of release. I finally turned in, determined to forget my troubles in oblivion. But I could not sleep. Over and over I reviewed the case, particularly the latest phases of it, and wondered if Dick's ring in the secret room, where it certainly had no business to be, might not serve as a clue upon which to secure Ruth's release. Then my mind wandered to Lee and the girl of the perfume, to Cunningham and the gold and blue room, until gradually it seemed to me that a delicious fragrance pervaded from the room, and I drifted into the land of dreams. And in that sleep I dreamed a weird and awful dream. I thought I stood in the secret room behind the safe, which somehow resembled the gold and blue room in Cunningham's apartment, and as I stood there breathing the fragrance of Rose Jacqueminot, a man dashed by me and entered the study. He had a pistol in his hand, and as he fired at Darwin, whom I could see dimly in the distance, I heard a woman shriek. Then the man came back, dragging a girl by the arm, and as he went by me he dropped Dick's ring at my feet, and turned toward me such a face as I hope never to see even in my dreams again. It was the face of a demon distorted by passion, and it bore no resemblance to any one I knew, or rather, it was a composite of those concerned in the case, for he had Dick's eyes, Lee's nose and chin, and Cunningham's red hair. A moment I looked into his mad eyes, and then I saw him raise his arm and fire at the girl, and I realized with horror that she was Ruth. With a cry I flung myself toward him and woke with my arms around my pillow. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Mystery of the Hidden Room. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mystery of the Hidden Room by Marion HARVEY. Chapter 30. The Curio Shop. I sat up and passed my hand dazedly across my brow, and then suddenly I was broad awake and listening intently to the sound that had startled me, the sound of my door opening stealthily. I peered through the darkness, but could discern nothing. I waited a moment, but hearing no further sound, reached under my pillow for my revolver, for I knew I wasn't dreaming now, noticing by my radium-faced watch that it was close to midnight. Then, as I became conscious of another presence in the room, the light was switched on without warning, and I flung out my arm, covering the man who stood there before me. He was a rough-looking customer in an ugly, worn blue suit, and his cap was pulled low over his brow. His face was unshaved, his lips were coarse, his nose was thick, his eyebrows bushy, and the eyes beneath were sunken and dull, a dead black in color. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, holding the pistol in line with his heart. But he did not reply except by a chuckle, and I flung down the pistol with the cry, "McKelvie!" "I'm glad I pass muster," he said, chuckling again, but I could only stare at him in genuine amazement. Except for that chuckle I should never have known him. "Here," he said, flinging a bundle on my bed. "Get into those things as fast as you can and meet me in your library. We have no time to waste, but I knew you would never forgive me if I left you out of this." As soon as he was gone I attired myself in the battered old suit of brown which he had provided, and clapped a greasy cap upon my head. Then I surveyed myself in the mirror and turned away disappointedly. I was disreputable enough in all conscience, for no one would have taken me for anyone else but Carlton Davies, grown somewhat seedy in appearance. How did McKelvie do it? In the library I found McKelvie talking to Jenkins, the latter clad in bathrobe and slippers, as though he had just been dragged from his room. "Ready?" asked McKelvie as I entered, and when I nodded he turned again to Jenkins. "Stay out in the hall beside the phone and don't go to sleep. If I do not phone you by 1 o'clock, call headquarters and tell them to rush some men to Hi Ling's Curio Shop. You understand?" "Yes, sir," answered Jenkins, blinking. "Don't fall asleep, as it may mean our lives," repeated McKelvie impressively. "No, sir, I'll stay awake. You can depend on me, sir," said Jenkins in a hurt tone. "Yes, I know I can," returned McKelvie. "Come on, Mr. Davies." McKelvie swung toward me and then began to laugh. "You're far too clean. They'd spot you for a fake in a moment." He took what looked like a box of lampblack from his pocket and applied it to my face. As we hurried down the hall, I glanced at my reflection in the mirror. My face was a dirty, gray, sallow, unshaved. I smiled as I followed McKelvie into the outer hall. "Ever read Gaboriau?" he asked as we crept stealthily down the stairs. "Yes." "Then you know the advice that Lecoq gave his men when they wanted to disguise themselves. 'Change the eye,' he said. 'The eye is the important factor in disguise.' He was right, and I have spent some time practicing the maxim. Try to look stupid and your eyes will deaden. Not that way," and he caught my arm as I made for the lobby. "The back entrance for ours, unless we want to land in a cell at the police station." We sneaked out into the back yard, around the building, and out into the street, where a motor car was waiting. "All right, Wilkins, full speed ahead," said McKelvie as we got in. With a jerk, we were off toward the park. "Now," I demanded, "what's it all about?" "You've got your pistol with you?" he asked, and when I answered in the affirmative, he went on, "Don't use it unless I give you leave. The less shooting the better for us, I expect." "Is it Lee?" I inquired. "Yes. My offer of reward hustled things up a bit." McKelvie leaned forward and called out, "Faster, Wilkins! We'll never make it at this rate." "He's in danger, then," I said, as we tore around corners and down side streets to avoid the cops. "Yes, but let me begin at the beginning. Wilkins got onto the track of a mysterious taxi that had been seen on Mott Street about 4:15 the afternoon of October the 8th, and while he was hanging around one of those Chinese joints, he saw two toughs lounging down Pell Street, and evidently discussing the reward, since one of them was waving the handbill in the other's face. Wilkins followed them into an eating house, and by securing a table next to them, overheard their conversation. It seemed that they had identified Lee as the young man they had kidnapped, and they were weighing the respective merits of giving their information to me or blackmailing the old man, as they called whoever had hired them. The younger tough was for telling me, but the older one seemed to think that they could make more from the old man. Whereupon the younger one declared that the old fellow was stingier than hell, and reminded his companion that Hai Ling had tipped them that the young man was to disappear that night, after the boss's visit at 1 o'clock. When the men separated, Wilkins followed the younger one, and by many judicious hints and the added compensation of some money and promised immunity from the police, he got the rest of the story. This fellow and his companion had been hired to kidnap a young chap, and they had deposited him in Hai Ling's back shop in an upstairs room. There was something the young man knew that the old man wanted to learn so much he had gathered from the Chinaman who kept the shop. In other words, Lee knew something of the murder, and the criminal wanted to find out just how much, or else he wanted to keep Lee from giving evidence. It doesn't matter which. The main fact remains that he is holding the boy a prisoner. Well, when he realized that through my efforts I was bound to learn where Lee was, since he did not trust the toughs, he gave orders that when he had paid the boy his customary visit at 1 o'clock, they were to get rid of Lee for him. One more murder wouldn't disturb his conscience very much, I guess. Our only chance lies in getting there ahead of the criminal." "How do you know it's not a trap?" I asked. "I've provided for that by my orders to Jenkins. If it's a trap, the police will have to rescue us, that's all. I feel conscience-stricken, lugging you into what may turn out to be a fight for life," he added. "You needn't. I wouldn't have missed it for anything," I returned. "But why don't you surround the place with the police right away?" "Do you know where we are going?" he asked curiously. "To Chinatown, I should judge," I answered. "Exactly. They keep scouts on the watch at those places, which are respectable without and hells within. The moment they saw the sight of a uniform, Lee Darwin would disappear, and no one would ever learn what had become of him. Days later an unrecognizable corpse would be dragged from the river." I shuddered. What a horrible end for the boy if we should fail to reach him in time! At this juncture the car stopped with a jerk at the corner of Mott and Hester Streets, and we piled out. "Wait here for us. If we do not come back by 1:30 you can go home," said McKelvie. The man turned off his engine and settled himself to wait, and the next moment we were hurrying toward Pell Street. Then we turned another corner and, modifying our pace, lounged carelessly toward the back entrance of Heiling's Curio Shop. Remembering Lecoq's advice, I tried to look dull and stupid as McKelvie opened the door. We stepped inside the shop and faced the Chinaman seated behind a counter at the rear of the room. He was a fat old Chinaman, and he gazed at us stolidly as he smoked his pipe. In a coarse voice McKelvie asked whether the "old man" had come, saying he had sent us to stay with the prisoner until his arrival. The Chinaman looked at us unblinkingly for 5 steady minutes. Then he waved his pipe toward a rear door. We shuffled toward it as fast as we dared, and I, for one, expected that every minute he would call us back and question us more closely. But he did not move, and we gained the doorway and saw before us, in the flickering light of a gas jet from above, a staircase, steep, narrow, dirty. This we climbed and found ourselves in a small entry with a door at the back. Stealing to this door, McKelvie listened intently for a moment, then drew his revolver and tried the door softly. It was locked. Shifting the gun to his left hand, he took out a long, narrow steel instrument, which he inserted in the lock. As the door yielded silently, he stole into the room, and I followed him closely. I did not hear, but I knew he had closed the door behind us, and then his flash glowed and the disk of light darted here and there over the black interior of the room, or rather hole, in which we found ourselves. It was empty save for a narrow cot, on which lay an inert figure, apparently asleep. We moved closer to the cot, and McKelvie let the disk of light rest upon the face of the man before us. It was Lee Darwin. I could not be mistaken, but he looked as though he were in the last stages of some terrible disease. His form was quite wasted. His eyes were mere sunken hollows in his ghastly face, and his cheekbones stood out prominently where the flesh had fallen away. I contemplated him in horrified silence until a touch on my arm recalled me to action. "I'm afraid he's too far gone to walk," whispered McKelvie. "We'll have to carry him. The main thing is to get him out before the criminal arrives. I don't think the old Chink will give us much trouble." Silently McKelvie bent over Lee and shook him into consciousness. The boy opened his haggard eyes, stared at the flash, then shuddered away from McKelvie's restraining hand. "Go away," he said feebly. "I have nothing to tell you. Nothing, I say." "Mr. Darwin," said McKelvie soothingly, "it's all right. We only want to help you get away." Lee turned toward the sound of the voice, a dawning wonder in his eyes. Then, as the sense of McKelvie's words penetrated his dulled brain, and the sound of McKelvie's rich voice fell like balm on his spirit, which had been harassed for days by harsh voices and coarse threats, he put out his hand and pushed aside the flash, which McKelvie still kept focused on his face. "Help me get up," he said. In the darkness, we helped him to his feet and got him out into the corridor, where he collapsed again. So we lifted him by his head and feet and carried him down the stairs. When we reached the bottom, we looked across into the placid face of the old Chinaman contemplating us fixedly from the doorway. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Mystery of the Hidden Room. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mystery of the Hidden Room by Marion HARVEY. Chapter 31. The Rescue. "Lord!" McKelvie muttered, low, as we sat Lee down upon the lowest step. "He's evidently in the game, too. No wonder he was so obliging about letting us pass, since there probably is no outlet yonder," and he jerked his head toward the top of the stairs. He pulled out his gun and leveled it at the Chinaman. "Now then, Hi, or whatever your name is, just raise your arms above your head and back into that room, or you'll get a taste of this," and he tapped his revolver menacingly, but the Chinaman only continued to regard us placidly, with no change of expression on his yellow countenance. McKelvie spoke to me in an undertone. "He knows darn well I won't shoot, damn him, since it would bring the house about our ears. I have a better plan. I'll take Lee on my back, and you can give yonder Chinaman a punch in the jaw. Then we'll make tracks for the door. Once we get outside we'll be fairly safe, for these Chinamen don't want a row with the police if they can avoid it." He slipped his automatic back into his pocket, and while he slung Lee over his shoulder, I swaggered up to the Chinaman. "Better let us pass, Bo," I said roughly in character, to gain time. "You might get hurt, Chink." Again that stolid indifference, as though to him we did not exist, which made my blood boil and gave my arm an added impetus. The next moment the Chinaman was sprawling on the ground and we had gained the other room. With my cap pulled well over my face, I was making tracks for the door to get it open for us to pass when I heard a yell from McKelvie. "Duck!" he cried, and as I obeyed I heard something whiz over my head, and a hatchet buried itself in the wall ahead of me. I turned sharply and grappled with a lithe, yellow-clad figure that had sprung at me from the side of the room. In tense silence we struggled, each striving to reach the other's throat, and as we fought I caught a glimpse of some heavy metal object on a stand near one corner of the room. Warily, inch by inch, I forced my adversary back until he fell against the stand, losing his balance and almost carrying me with him. With an effort I kept my feet, freeing my arm with a sudden movement, and as he swayed, clutching at me, I grasped the metal candlestick and brought it down upon his head. His fingers loosened from my arm and he went down with a sickening thud. Then, panting, I turned to look for McKelvie. He was standing in the opposite corner, shielding Lee's unconscious form, with his gun covering the old Chinaman whom I had first knocked out and who had succeeded in joining the fray again, and now stood as stolidly as ever beside a third Chinaman who lay prostrate on the floor. I advanced to McKelvie's side, and as I did so I glanced again at the prostrate Chinaman. To my horror, he was not as insensible as I had first supposed. One arm was drawn back, and he was on the point of hurling a murderous-looking hatchet at McKelvie's head. "Look out!" I yelled, but McKelvie had seen him too. There was a spat from McKelvie's gun, the hatchet went flying backwards, and the Chinaman rolled over, howling with pain and rage. The momentary diversion, however, had served the other Chinaman in good stead. Before I could reach him he had glided to a counter, lifted a clapper, and struck upon a gong. The next moment the Chinks came pouring in about us like rats from their holes. I managed somehow to reach McKelvie's side before the onslaught began, and together we kept our backs to the corner where Lee lay huddled. Then McKelvie raised his pistol and deliberately shot out the light. After that confusion reigned. I could hear the scuffle of feet, an occasional flash from McKelvie's gun, and a scream of agony as the bullet tore its way through soft flesh, followed by a quick report from my automatic, which I had drawn even though he had given me no leave. Then again the shuffle of feet, while we warded off blows and tried to keep our unseen enemies at a distance. And then into the midst of this turmoil a high-pitched voice cut like a knife. It was not a Chinaman's voice. It was a refined, cultivated, but distinctly American voice, and it seemed to me that I had heard its intonation before at some time. Querulously it demanded a light, and as someone lighted the gas the Chinaman fell away from before us. We were battered and bruised, McKelvie and I, but otherwise unhurt, and we still stood with our backs to Lee Darwin, protecting him from the assault of his foes. In the flickering light of the one poor burner I could see that the room was filled with Chinamen, or perhaps I mistook shadows for the reality, since though they remained inactive, they shuffled about in the background, passing and repassing each other continually. Then a man stepped forward into the limelight, and I saw the owner of that cutting voice. With arms folded and head thrust forward, he stood and glared malevolently at McKelvie, and I beheld with astonishment the bent old figure and the white hair and beard shining like silver in that light. Though he took no notice of me, still I could feel his antagonism, and wished for a moment that he would cast aside the heavy blue glasses he wore and give me a chance to see his eyes. "So," he said in that high-pitched voice, sarcastically strident in its intonation, "you thought to get ahead of me, eh? You thought I was such a fool that I wouldn't prepare for your visit, eh? There are a few people still left who have more brains than you think, Mr. McKelvie." McKelvie returned his empty gun to his pocket very coolly, and then laughed softly. "Stand aside and let Hai Ling take that boy. Then I will settle with you, Mr. Detective," went on the old man, unfolding his arms and thrusting a hand into the pocket of the long coat he wore. McKelvie laughed again. "Come and get him, you murderer," he said quietly. With a snarl of rage, the man flung out his arm and fired. I saw McKelvie draw aside quickly and then bite his lips as his left arm fell limply at his side. With a curse I leaped forward, but McKelvie pulled me back just as there arose a banging on the outer door and a shrill whistle sounded clear and loud outside. There was a cry of "Police! The police!" and with an oath the old man fired again at Lee, and then he shot up tall and extinguished the light. Pandemonium was let loose. There was a scurry of feet, the banging of a door, yells and execrations, hoarse cries, men's voices shouting loudly, and then something struck me on the head. I fell heavily to the ground, and as I did so a flash was thrust into my face, and I heard Jones's voice exclaim as from a great distance, "Mr. Davies, by all that's holy!" and then blackness descended upon me. I came to myself with the sensation that someone was pouring red-hot liquid down my throat. I sat up, gasping, to find Jones bending over me with a brandy flask in his hand. "All right?" he asked. Recollection swept over me. "Where's McKelvie?" I managed to reply. "Yonder." Jones nodded his head toward the chair where McKelvie sat, grinning like a Cheshire cat. His clothes were torn, his face was smeared with blood, and his left arm had been recently bandaged, but he wore the expression of a conqueror as he commanded the doctor to cease fussing over him and to look after Lee, who was still unconscious. Then I realized that we were no longer in the Curio Shop, but in McKelvie's living room, and that Lee was lying upon a couch, as motionless and rigid as a corpse. The doctor ordered that the boy be put to bed, and McKelvie told Jones to ring for Dinah. When she came in presently, wrapped in an old kimono and with her woolly wig more belligerent than ever, McKelvie asked her to get a room ready. Then the doctor and Jones carried Lee from the room. "What happened after I went down?" I asked, feeling the lump on my head. "I remember hearing Jones, and that is all." "I'm ashamed to acknowledge that when I knew that the police were actually in the room, I fainted," he replied with a grin. "When I came to myself, those Chinamen who could get away had vanished, and with them the old man. I'd have given 10 years of my life to get a glimpse of his eyes behind those glasses. I have a feeling that once having seen them, I should never forget them." "So he got away?" I said. "Oh, yes. Jones of course knew nothing about him, and when I was in a condition to explain, the fellow was far away. The police searched for him, but without avail. So I told them not to bother and ordered Jones to bring us here." He sat back with a smile, but I could see that his arm was giving him pain. "It was a great fight, and the best part was that we were able to rescue Lee." "Yes," I replied, "I should very much like to hear his story. By the way, that vindictive old man didn't shoot him, did he?" "No, I don't believe he more than grazed him, if he hit him at all. Naturally, he was trying to prevent us from taking the boy away from there." "He had no trouble recognizing you," I continued. "Has he seen you before?" "Doubtless. A man of his caliber would acquaint himself with his adversaries for safety's sake. He saw me the night we chased him in the study, and what is more, I made no attempt to disguise myself tonight when he stood there looking at me. That's why he tried to kill me. I read his purpose, though, and waited until he had flung out his arms to fire, and then I moved aside, but not quite out of range, as you saw." And he glanced at his arm. "But here is Jones. What does the doctor say?" "He'll pull him around. That black woman of yours is certainly a trump. She's making him some broth. The boy's starved," answered Jones, and then he looked at us and grinned. "It's a good thing for you fellows that I happened to be at headquarters tonight when your man called us, Mr. Davies. I twigged what was up and had the dope in a second, so I was able to get you in time." "I'm eternally grateful to you, Jones, and so is Mr. Davies," returned McKelvie, holding out his hand, which Jones accepted with a sheepish smile. "But for you, we might be occupying the river by now." "Don't say any more," expostulated Jones, as I added my share of gratitude. "It's all part of the job. Well, Doctor?" "He's coming on fine. He's got a good nurse. I'll be around in the morning to have another look at him. said the doctor. "And now my advice to you, sir," returning to McKelvie, "is to get to bed and let that arm have a chance to recover. That was a nasty flesh wound you got. Come along, Jones." "I'll be around again, too," said Jones, "to hear that young man's story. I don't know what this all has to do with the murder, but his tale should be interesting, to say the least." We agreed, and then went upstairs, where we got rid of our rags and had a good wash. Then McKelvie loaned me a pair of pajamas and a bed, which had never been more welcome to my throbbing head. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Mystery of the Hidden Room. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mystery of the Hidden Room by Marion HARVEY. Chapter 32. Lee's Story. Despite his arm, which he had redressed himself and which was quite stiff, McKelvie was up ahead of me, and when I came down at noon, attired in my own garments, McKelvie had phoned Jenkins to bring me my things, I felt quite like myself again. "Has the doctor been here?" I asked as we had our luncheon. "Yes, but he will be back later. Lee is still asleep. We shall hear his story this afternoon." Then he sighed. "I wish we had been able to catch that old chap. I am positive he is the murderer. I felt it in my bones when he looked at me, and my bones are quite infallible, I assure you." And he smiled whimsically. "It is a pity," I said, "for then this business would be over." When we rose from the table and went back to the living room, McKelvie moved about restlessly and then said impatiently, "I wish the doctor would come. I want to get at the boy's story as soon as possible, for I think he may help us locate Cora Manning, and we shall have to work fast now if we expect to catch the criminal. He's too clever to hang around much longer, now that he knows the game is up, as far as Mrs. Darwin is concerned." I heartily endorsed McKelvie's words, for I was eager to hear what Lee had to say, but he did not waken until 5 o'clock, and the doctor, who had come in some time previous, forbade our disturbing him. When we finally mounted to his room, Jones, McKelvie, and we could hardly wait for the doctor's assurance that he thought it would not harm the young man to talk. As we gathered about the bed, Lee leaned back against his pillows, his hollow cheeks flushed, and his black eyes glittering strangely as he looked at us. I heard Jones mutter something about "eyes like a madman's," which Lee evidently overheard, for he turned to the doctor with an appealing glance. "Before I begin," he said in a weak voice, "I want you, doctor, to answer me a question. Am I perfectly rational and sane?" "Yes, perfectly sane," responded the doctor quietly. Lee breathed a sigh of relief. "Please remember that, gentlemen," he continued. "I may look mad, but I'm not. No, nor have ever been, though at times I thought I was pretty near to it." He paused to gather strength, and then he told his tale almost without a break, for it gripped him too vitally to admit of his stopping once he had begun. "To explain my actions, I must go back to the morning of the 7th. I testified at the inquest that I quarreled with my uncle about Ruth. I lied. We quarreled about Cora Manning." At this name Jones leaned closer, a greater interest in his face. "I met her a year ago when she came to New York to study for the stage. 3 months ago we became engaged, and I gave her, as is customary, a diamond ring. Later I introduced my uncle to her. Instantly he evinced a great interest in her, cloaking his infatuation, I know it was that now, under the guise of a desire to aid her in her career. He took her out a number of times, and when I protested, she accused me of being jealous of my uncle, which she said was unworthy of me if I loved her, since my uncle was an old married man. To make a long story short, on the morning of the 7th, as I was leaving the house, my uncle called me back into the study and there showed me the ring I had given Cora, swearing she had bestowed it upon him to return it to me, as she no longer cared for me and was coming to see him there in the study that night. He had the ring on the little finger of his left hand, and he pulled it off with a laugh and held it toward me. I snatched it from him and flung it in his face, and would have leaped upon him to strangle him then and there, but he read my purpose in my face, and like the craven that he was, he called to Orton to come into the room. Then he ordered me to leave his house, and I went out by the window, vowing vengeance upon him. I hurried to Cora's and accused her of treachery, declaring I'd kill my uncle before he should have her. I was mad, crazy, and refusing to listen to any explanations, I rushed away and bought a pistol. That evening I hung around the house on Riverside Drive. I would wait her arrival and then go in and kill them both. I saw my uncle let himself into the house, and about an hour later Mr. Davies arrived, but still no Cora. I began to think I had been a fool, but determined to wait a while longer just to make sure. About 11:45, for I looked at my watch as I reached the gate, I saw her coming down the street with a suitcase in her hand. Mad with rage, I hid behind some bushes and followed her as she turned into the grounds. It was very dark, and I lost her as she slipped around the house. I decided to enter by the front door and confront them. Then I recalled that Mr. Davies had not yet gone, and determined to try the windows. I crept to the second window, and by means of my flash saw that the shade did not come level with the bottom of the window. I knelt down and applied my eye to this space. By looking upward from the extreme corner of the window, I discovered that I could see what my uncle was doing. The room was dark except for the lamp that threw its rays over the table and chair, and in the latter my uncle was reclining, asleep. Then as I looked, suddenly Cora appeared beside the table, and in her hand she carried a small pistol. She pointed it at my uncle, and just then the light went out. I judged that she had shot him, though I heard no sound, and so paralyzed with horror was I, that I remained where I was gazing into the darkness of the room before me. How long I stayed there I don't know. Presently I thought I heard the sound of a step on the walk. I wrenched myself free from the entangling ivy and hastened to the gate. There was no one in sight. For a long time I stood there, debating whether to go back or not, and then I came to the conclusion that if she had really shot my uncle, she needed every minute to get away. I fled the place and paced the streets in an agony of suspense. In the morning I returned to the club, where I slept until noon. When the steward woke me, my first thought was for Cora. I dashed around to Gramercy Park. She was gone, had been gone since the night before. Then I rushed up to my uncle's house, thinking she might have been caught. I found the coroner in possession. Persuaded that Cora had killed my uncle, and not seeing her present, I determined to shield her by denying all knowledge of her. After my testimony, I went upstairs to my rooms, gathered together a few necessary articles, and went back to Gramercy Park. She was still missing. I thought of advertising for her and had gone as far as the Herald office, when it occurred to me that by locating her I would only be putting her life in danger. Dejectedly I returned to the club once more, and there found a written message awaiting me. I read and destroyed it, but the words are burned into my brain. Lee, my darling, I killed him to save my honor. If you love me, help me to get away. I could not bear the notoriety of a trial. Meet me at the corner of 23rd Street and 3rd Avenue, and I'll be waiting for you in a brown taxi. Cora. I told the steward to hold my rooms as I was going south on business, and took a taxi to 25th and 3rd Avenue, where I dismissed the man and walked rapidly to 23rd Street. Lee paused and drew a gasping breath, whereupon the doctor hastened to administer a stimulant. "The car was waiting?" prompted McKelvie. "Yes, and when I appeared the door opened and a hand beckoned. I entered the car unsuspectingly, but I was no sooner seated and the door had been closed. It was dark as pitch inside, since all the shades were drawn. Then I felt a hand on my face and smelled something that made me gasp. Some instinct warned me not to breathe, and I thrust out my hand and my fingers closed on a man's rough coat. Then I realized I'd been trapped and flung myself toward my assailant. He grasped my throat and thrust a handkerchief over my face. The deadly fumes got into my lungs, for I felt myself suffocating, and drawing a deep involuntary breath, I fell unconscious. When I came to, I was lying in the room where you found me, and a couple of ruffians were guarding me. I do not recall much of this part of the affair, for I was kept in a semi-conscious state most of the time, and left absolutely alone all day, with little or no food. I have an impression that once every night I was shaken into consciousness by someone who spoke in a harsh whisper and asked me a lot of questions about the murder. Fearing for Cora, I refused to answer. Every day I grew weaker, and every day the harsh voice grew more insistent, until the man, whoever he was, started to torture me as well. The day before you rescued me, I lost all consciousness of what was going on, for my mind had been partly drugged, I believe. I guess that's all, except that I want to thank you fellows for getting me out of there." Lee closed his eyes wearily, and Jones scratched his head in perplexity. "If what he says is true," whispered Jones to me, "where does Mrs. Darwin come in? He must have dreamed all this. Darwin was shot at midnight." "He didn't dream that he had been held a prisoner, at least," I returned. "As for the rest, I presume it's all true enough." And I turned toward McKelvie to get his opinion on the matter. "Mr. Darwin," McKelvie said, as Lee opened his eyes again, "are you strong enough to answer some questions?" "Yes," Lee answered. "Describe the man who questioned you." "I never saw him. The room was always dark. I heard his voice, that is all. It was always a harsh whisper. But wait, once I put out my hand and felt a beard, long and silky." McKelvie nodded quickly. "What questions did he ask you?" "He asked me where I was the night of the murder, and he kept saying over and over, 'Someone you love is in danger, and when you tell me what you know about your uncle's murder, she will be freed.' I had a feeling this was another trap," Lee went on, since if I told him that she had committed the murder they would send her to prison. I had no idea what his connection with the affair might be, but I determined not to be caught napping again. "There is no connection between him and the murder," responded Jones authoritatively. "We've got the criminal locked up this minute." "Oh, have you?" returned McKelvie sarcastically. "Just listen to what I have since discovered, Jones." And he sketched rapidly the main facts in the case. They listened spellbound as he told of the secret entrance and the second shot, declaring that Darwin was murdered at 11:40 by the man we had seen in the Curio Shop, that this man was keeping Cora Manning a prisoner and had deliberately set about implicating Ruth in the murder. Jones's eyes grew wide with astonishment as he listened, for it upset all his preconceived ideas. "Then she didn't kill him. Thank God, thank God," sobbed Lee, quite overcome by all he had been through. "No, she didn't kill him," returned McKelvie kindly. "And now we are going to do our best to find her for you." End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Mystery of the Hidden Room. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mystery of the Hidden Room by Marion HARVEY. Chapter 33. The Second Bullet. When we were downstairs again and the doctor had gone, Jones turned to me. McKelvie was smoking his pipe and pacing the room, his brows knit in thought, and Jones did not like to disturb him. "I say, Mr. Davies, can't you give a fellow a few more details?" he begged. "I seem to have got the dope all wrong in this case. Who is this mysterious man?" I glanced at McKelvie, but he was paying no attention to our conversation. I decided that there was no harm in telling Jones all that we knew, since McKelvie himself had already disclosed the more vital points. So I gave Jones a rapid account of our search for the criminal, how we had discovered the secret entrance, where the trail of the sachet bags had led us, how we had interviewed Orton, Mrs. Harmon, and Cunningham, and how the finding of Dick's ring led to the discovery that he was still alive. "But as regards the mysterious man in the curio shop," I ended, "I can't tell you who he is since I don't know, but my impression is that he was disguised, and that he is not old at all, for one moment he was feeble and bent, and the next, when he turned off the light, tall and strong." Jones slapped his hand on his knee. "By George, you're right. What did he look like, anyway?" "When I first saw him he was bent, and his head was thrust forward, his hair and beard were silver white, his eyes protected by blue glasses," I answered. "Disguised all right," said Jones with conviction. "It's a remarkable thing now, Mr. Davies, but when a man runs to disguise he always chooses the appearance which is his very opposite, the idea being, I suppose, to look as unlike his former self as possible. He stooped and was old, therefore he really is young and tall. He wore whiskers and glasses, therefore he is smooth-shaven and has good eyesight. That's your man. And if you add the fact that he is dark, you have a pretty good description of the murderer," put in McKelvie suddenly. "Good heavens!" I began, but McKelvie raised his hand. "Keep your suspicions to yourself," he said, and returned to his meditation. "Seems to me you've made pretty good progress so far," Jones continued, "but what you need is the police on his trail. We'd soon have him where he belongs." Well, I don't know that we have made so much progress after all, I went on, as McKelvie ignored Jones's insinuation. We have reduced the number of suspects by finding Lee, but we really are no further than we were 3 days ago. We progress so slowly, I added impatiently, because we discover only unsubstantiated facts. We thought Lee might be able to help us, but he cannot swear to having seen his uncle die, and without that proof, Ruth must stay in jail. I'm sorry, returned Jones. The only thing to do is to catch the criminal, or learn his identity. How? I demanded. Did Jones think he could win out where McKelvie had been unsuccessful? Then I recalled McKelvie's words before he took the case, when he had handed me his list of questions. Find the answers to those questions and you will have the name of the man who committed the crime. We ought to be able to answer almost all of them by now. I pulled out my wallet and opened it, drawing forth the sheets that I had placed there less than a week ago, it seemed more like years, and spread them out in front of Jones, explaining their purpose and how I came by them. He read them through, glanced at McKelvie's back, he was seeking inspiration from the falling night, and then he grinned. "Say," he whispered loudly, "we ought to be able to dope it out, you and I. I'll read you the questions and you give me the answers." He took out his fountain pen, prepared to fill in my replies, and I humored him. Question 1. Why was the pistol fired at midnight? Jones asked. To implicate Ruth, I returned. Did the murderer also light the lamp? Jones's pen scratched away as he spoke. Yes, he lighted it from the safe, I said, explaining how we had ascertained this fact. How did he enter and leave the room? He entered by the window and he left by the secret entrance, I replied, remembering McKelvie's assertion. Wrong. McKelvie swung toward us for a moment. He entered by the door. But I thought you said, I began. I've changed my mind, he retorted, and turned his back on us again. Jones's eyebrows went up a trifle, and then he asked, What was the motive for the murder? I don't know, I said frankly. It seems to me that answer depends on who murdered him. Find the murderer and you have the motive, not learn the motive and you have your man, as in most cases, I added. We'll leave number 4 blank then. Why did the doctors disagree, and which was in the right? I recall that fact now. They had quite a tiff over it, and the young doctor was worsted. Jones laughed at the recollection. My answer astonished him. I'd say they disagreed because the coroner's physician was a pompous old ass, I returned vindictively. I could not forget that in very truth Ruth's accusal had been the result of this verdict. Dr. Haskins was in the right, since Darwin was shot at 11:40. Why did Philip Darwin put that ring on his finger and then take it off again? Cunningham explained that Darwin did it in a moment of sentimentality. It seemed an idiotic thing to do, after all, and I don't believe he was addicted to sentiment, I said. Well, no, he might have had it in his hand and slipped it on unthinkingly, and then had trouble taking it off, replied Jones reflectively. I shook my head. No, I am inclined to believe that he hurt his finger with Cora's ring. Lee said his uncle was wearing it on his little finger, and that he removed it hastily and handed it to him. It was probably tight for him, and so he bruised the finger, I said. Where's the diamond, then? Asked Jones. "It may have fallen out and the murderer may have found it," I returned. "Or, better yet, Orton may have taken it. You know Lee flung the ring at his uncle." "That's plausible, and I never liked the secretary's face anyway. Whose was the blood-stained handkerchief?" continued Jones. "Cora Manning's, because of the perfume which all her male friends seem to have adopted also," I remarked. "Where did the second bullet go?" "By the way, McKelvie, where did it go?" I inquired. But he pretended not to hear me, so I said to Jones with a laugh, "Another blank. I have no idea where it went." "Did McKelvie search the room?" "With a magnifying glass. It's not there." "That's queer. It's bound to be somewhere. I'll have to have a look myself. Why is there so much evidence against Mrs. Darwin?" I permitted myself a smile at Jones's evident estimate of McKelvie's abilities as far as searching a room was concerned. Then I replied to his question. "I suppose the criminal believed in being thorough while he was about it." "Who and what is Cora Manning?" "She is, or was, Lee's fiancée. As to what she is, I'll tell you better when I see her. According to McKelvie, she's a beauty," and I smiled. "Also, if you can believe what he says, the criminal is in love with this girl, so she is not the one who fired the shot." "So McKelvie says, but if the criminal loves her, how do we know she wasn't his tool?" "Even the boy upstairs thought she had killed his uncle," remarked Jones. "Don't be an idiot, Jones," said McKelvie's voice. "She wasn't likely to shoot a man who was already dying when she entered the room. She got there at 11:45 or later." "Oh, yes, I forgot that fact. But the boy's watch may have been fast at that," replied Jones, unabashed. "She pointed a pistol at him, you know." "Yes, and I presume she kept the man she loves in duress all this time? But have it your own way," returned McKelvie dryly. Then I heard him add to himself, "Where can she be? If I could only lay my finger on her hiding place, I'd have him in my toils." "What has become of Darwin's securities?" Jones returned to the paper before him. "Cunningham says Darwin lost his fortune in Wall Street," I answered. "What is Lee Darwin's connection with the affair?" "Like Ruth, he is a victim of circumstances and the criminal's machinations," I said. "Why did Richard Trenton come to New York and then commit suicide?" Jones went on. "He came to New York at Darwin's request to see him. This we know to be a fact," and I told Jones the gist of Gilmore's story. "Also, we know that he did not commit suicide, although he tried to give the world that impression." "That looks very bad. What's Cunningham's relation to the murdered man?" "Just his friend, since Cunningham is not a lawyer." "That looks bad, too," said Jones. "He acted as counsel at the inquest illegally, then." "He says not. That he did not see Mrs. Darwin and gave her no advice. You can prosecute him when the case is over. We have no time for that now," I added. "Which one of those having sufficient motive for killing Darwin answers to the description, clever, unprincipled, absolutely cold-blooded?" "There is an immense amount of latitude in that question. There might be any number of men of that type, since we do not know how many may have had sufficient motive for killing him. I expect that we haven't met all the men who have grudges against him, not by a long shot." And now, Mr. Jones, having doped it out, as you expressed it, would you mind telling me who committed that murder?" I asked quizzically. Jones grinned. "I'll be hanged if I know," he replied. "But then we have not answered all the questions, you know. There's the motive and that second bullet. Oh, I say, McKelvie, what about letting me get busy on the trail of the revolver that made that second shot? There is a good substantial clue for you, though I know your preference for deductions." McKelvie turned away from the window, laughing at Jones's irony, then said quietly, "I won't trouble you to locate it, as it might inconvenience you sadly. You see, I know where it is." "You do?" Jones looked incredulous. "You know where it is, and you haven't produced it?" "How could I, when you have had it under lock and key at headquarters right from the start?" returned McKelvie, his eyes twinkling. "I? Oh, no, you're wrong there. I have only Darwin's pistol," replied Jones. "That's the one I refer to." "But, man, there's only one shot fired from that, the shot that killed Darwin," expostulated Jones. "Use your imagination, Jones. Did you never hear of a man's cleaning his pistol and recharging it?" inquired McKelvie sarcastically. "By Jove!" said Jones, then added quickly, "What about the second bullet, then? I don't happen to possess that, too, do I?" "No, for there was no second bullet." "No second bullet?" I exclaimed, remembering the stress he had laid on that fact. "No," he returned coolly, "there was no second bullet, because he took the trouble to remove it before he fired the cartridge." End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Mystery of the Hidden Room. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mystery of the Hidden Room by Marion HARVEY. Chapter 34. The Woman in the Case. My mind remained appalled before the contemplation of the devilish ingenuity of this man, who could plan the murder with such diabolical cunning. No wonder we were finding it a difficult matter to secure proof against him. Who was he? Was he someone I knew, or a stranger who had hitherto remained unsuspected by us? Did McKelvie have any idea of the man's identity, or was he also groping in the dark? Persistently I discarded the thought of Dick, even though the ring was his, and Jones's description of the criminal fitted the boy, for I could not believe that he could have become such a fiend, unless indeed he had suddenly lost all sense of proportion and balance. It was at this point in my meditations that Jones arose and declared that he must be going, but McKelvie refused to listen to him. He liked Jones, even though the two were so often on opposite sides of the case they were investigating. "Stay for dinner," McKelvie urged. "I owe you that much anyhow. Also, I may need you. And now I wish you fellows would cease worrying about the criminal's identity and put your faculties to work on a more pressing subject. Where do you suppose he has hidden Cora Manning?" Where, indeed, with the whole of New York to choose from? We were enjoying our after-dinner cigars when McKelvie suddenly gave a shout. "Eureka!" he cried. "I've got it! She's at Riverside Drive! What an idiot I was not to think of it before!" "How do you make that out?" asked Jones. "Lee thought he heard a step on the walk and assumed that it was the girl leaving the grounds. He hurried to the gate, but when he looked around there was no one in sight. If she had really left the place, he would have been in time to see her as she walked down the block. There would be no place for her to disappear to, unless she jumped in the river, which would hardly be likely." "She may have hidden in the grounds and have waited for Lee to go away first," I objected. "She did not know he was there, and would have no reason then for hiding. No, she's at the Darwin house. It was the easiest place to hide her in, safe and secure, and it would not involve his having to take anyone into his confidence. The house, doubtless, has more than one secret room. We'll go there now, and in an hour we'll have her free." "Do you want a taxi?" asked Jones. "No, we'll use the subway this time," replied McKelvie. We walked to Union Square and took the Broadway subway to Dyckman Street, walking from there to Riverside Drive. As we entered the Darwin grounds, I paused to admire the brilliancy of the stars, and noticed how the reflection of the lights from the river craft twinkled in the waters of the Hudson, as if in friendly rivalry. But my companions did not wait to look at the scenery, and I had to hurry to catch up with them. "We'll go in the back entrance again," said McKelvie. "I want to question Mason." After a slight delay the old man admitted us, and McKelvie asked him if he ever took occasion to go into the main wing of the house. "Yes, sir, I have been in it twice, sir, to open the windows and air the place against Mrs. Darwin's coming home," he replied. "And while you were there, did you hear any sounds? A person walking, for instance?" continued McKelvie. Mason looked at him in great surprise. "Oh, no, sir. There is no one in the house now, sir." "Is there an attic to the house?" "Yes, sir, but I'm sure there's no one there. I went in yesterday morning to put away Mr. Darwin's things, sir." "Have you any provisions in the house?" was the next question. "Yes, sir, for myself." "Prepare some broth for me, please. I'll send for it when I want it." "Yes, sir." "What's the idea? Do you think she's starving, too?" asked Jones as we crossed the passageway and entered the main hall. "Does he strike you as the kind that would be gentle with his prisoners? We'll ransack the whole house from attic to cellar, despite Mason's assertions." We ascended the broad staircase to the second floor. McKelvie then appointed the back room to Jones, the front ones to me, and reserved for himself the whole third floor, which was mostly the attic. My part comprised the sleeping apartments of Ruth as well as Darwin's suite. I entered Ruth's rooms first, but did not remain in them long, since every article spoke to me of the girl I loved, and who was at this moment enduring the hardness of a narrow cot in a barred and grated cell, instead of enjoying the comforts to which she had been always accustomed. And all this because she had been accused of a crime that she was certainly incapable of committing. Darwin's suite of dressing room, bedroom, and bath were also unproductive of any clues to Cora Manning's whereabouts, although once I thought I detected a faint odor of Rose Jacqueminot, and wondered idly whether Darwin, too, had caught the epidemic. Out in the hall I encountered Jones. "Nothing doing," he said. "Besides, she wouldn't be lying around loose, or that old butler would have come across her, unless he was lying. For my own part, I think this is a wild goose chase." Before I could reply, McKelvie descended from the attic. "Would you mind talking in a lower key?" he remarked in a whisper. "I could hear you distinctly upstairs, Jones, and if the criminal should come here, we would frighten him off for good." "You don't mean to tell me he'd have the nerve to come here!" exclaimed Jones. "He's come here more than once, as Mr. Davies and I can prove," he returned, drawing us into a room and closing the door. "Don't you suppose he comes here to see the girl? It's my opinion he is trying to break her into going away with him, though I can't see what is to stop him from drugging her and carrying her away." He walked to the window and looked out into the night. "She's not in the attic. There's no secret room up there, yet I'm positive she's in the house. He wouldn't come back for anything less important, though I did think once that he had a hiding place in the room behind the safe. You remember that I was looking for it the night we found Dick's ring," he continued, more to himself than to us. Then he turned away from the window, his eyes shining. "Lord, I'm growing dull. Do you recall, Mr. Davies, that we heard steps on the stone staircase, and that when I opened the door and turned my flash on the stairs, they were empty and the door below locked?" I nodded, and he went on quickly, "It never occurred to me before, but he must have vanished into a second secret room off those stairs. Come on, I'll bet that's where he's got her hidden." At the door, however, he paused to issue final instructions. "Go softly and obey me implicitly. Also, don't talk, and have your gun handy, Jones, in case of need." We tiptoed down the stairs and crossed the hall to the study door, which McKelvie opened slowly and silently. The room was dark. With the aid of his flash we walked down the length of the room to the safe, our footfalls deadened by the thickness of the carpet. Then McKelvie manipulated the dial and opened the safe. It was Jones's first initiation into the mysteries of the entrance, and I pulled him down to a stooping position as we passed through to the secret room. Then we crossed to the door at the head of the stairs, and McKelvie listened intently before he inserted his key in the lock. Then he turned to us. "Stay here," he whispered. "When I locate the room I'll call to you. If anyone comes in that lower door, don't hesitate to shoot, Jones." Jones and I obeyed and stood together in the darkness, watching the disk of light from McKelvie's flash dart here and there along the walls as McKelvie descended the stairs. Then the ray of light rested upon the wall into which the staircase had been built, and when extended about 3 feet beyond the lowest step, that is, extended the length of the distance between the bottom of the staircase and the outer door, which, being but 2 feet in width, had plenty of margin with which to swing inwards. On this 3 feet of wall space the light danced up and down as McKelvie hunted for indications of a second secret room. Then we heard him calling to us softly. We descended the stairs cautiously, and when we neared the bottom, McKelvie pressed a depression which he pointed out to us. We saw a section of the wall disappear from view, and the ray of light rested on the interior of a dark room. McKelvie stepped through first and called, "Miss Manning, are you there?" he asked. There was no answer, and telling us not to advance any further, he disappeared into the darkness. We strained forward to look, and I distinctly smelled a musty, damp odor, as though the room or cell, or whatever it was, had been used as a vault, or maybe a tomb. Then McKelvie came out again and swung the panel into place. He shivered slightly. "It's empty, but there are indications of a trap door in the ceiling. What is the room directly above this end of the study?" "Darwin's dressing room," I replied. "Any windows on this side?" "No." "Just as I thought. There is a room above that vault. We'll try the second floor. I trust we are not too late," he added as we returned to the study. There we waited while McKelvie relocked the entrance, and when he was ready to lead the way upstairs again, Jones spoke in a troubled whisper. "What's the idea of building a house with holes in the wall? It's a regular rat trap," he said. "I have a book at home that I'll have to lend you, Jones. The man who built this house was a nut on old-fashioned ideas. He copied an ancestral home, secret rooms and all. Not that he meant to use them, of course, but because it suited him to put them in. The one I just examined was used in ancient times, I think, to receive the bodies of those who fell through the trap door from the room above. A convenient way of getting rid of your enemy, that is all." "This criminal of yours seems very familiar with this house," said Jones. "Yes, he has been here many times before the murder, and he took pains to learn all he could about the place," returned McKelvie. "I thought he only learned of the entrance on the night of the murder," I objected. "Well, what of it? He is clever enough to have deduced what I did. He probably stumbled across the lower room in opening the outer door, and then it was mere child's play to discover the room above." "Yes, that part was easy enough, but it was another matter to find the hidden spring that worked the panel. We turned on the light in the room and divided the wall into 3 parts, each of us fingering a third carefully and painstakingly from top to bottom. It was Jones, finally, who stumbled on the spring. He had pressed the center of one of the mahogany flowers that formed the carved border of the dashboard, and silently the panel slid back. Never shall I forget the sight revealed to my eyes as the light from the dressing-room dispelled slightly the gloom of that interior. In the center of the narrow room kneeled a young girl, with her dark hair streaming about her shoulders and her pale face raised to heaven as she pressed the barrel of an automatic to her heart. In that attitude of utter renunciation she was very beautiful, so beautiful that she took away our breath and held us motionless. That at least was her effect upon Jones and myself, but McKelvie was less susceptible, or perhaps his quick eyes noted a motion that we did not observe. At any rate, he sprang forward and knocked up the pistol. There was a sharp report, and the girl fell forward into his arms in a dead faint. He carried her into Darwin's bedroom and laid her on the bed. While he worked over her, I descended to the kitchen where Mason was watching the broth McKelvie had ordered him to make. When I returned, she was sitting up, and as she sipped the broth, I looked at her again and felt my pulses stirring as I looked into her face. I'm not much of a hand at describing beauty in a woman, and perhaps the greatest compliment I can pay her is to say that though she had suffered and her lustrous black eyes were dull and her face wan and pale, she was beautiful still, and her voice held all the haunting quality of the South in its depths as she told us her story, a story so unusual that it was almost unbelievable. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Mystery of the Hidden Room. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mystery of the Hidden Room by Marion HARVEY. Chapter 35. A Strange Account. "I come of a race whose blood is hot and easily provoked," she began in a low voice, "and who consider honor a thing to be cherished and guarded. A year ago I came to New York to study for the stage, which had always been my ambition, and before I left New Orleans my dear old teacher told me to beware of the pitfalls of that great metropolis, which I intended to make my home. In the beginning I followed his advice and was wary, receiving no visitors, although I made many acquaintances. But when one is alone one becomes lonely, and so I permitted 2 young men to call upon me, since I knew that both of them came from good families. I was playing with fire without realizing it, for the elder of the 2, and he was hardly more than a boy, proposed to me when I had known him a month. I did not love him, and I told him so. In a burst of jealousy he accused me of being in love with his rival, and declared that since I would not marry him, he cared not what became of him. He would go straight to the devil, he said. I tried to be kind and to reason with him, but he was spoiled and wanted only his own way, so I told him he must not try to see me again, and he never did, for 6 months ago he left the city for good." As she paused in her recital, I realized with a shock that she was speaking of Dick Trenton. It was she who had given him the sachet then, and it was she who had been responsible, through the fault of that beauty with which nature had endowed her, for the attitude of devil-may-care which had made the boy an easy prey to Darwin's fascinations. What a mixed-up mess life really was! "3 months ago I became engaged to Lee Darwin," she continued, "and in an evil hour for both of us, Lee introduced his Uncle Philip to me. I knew Mr. Darwin was recently married, and so I deemed his interest in me what he said it was, a natural desire to aid me in my career. He took me to see the best actors and introduced me to 1 or 2 managers. Of course Lee was jealous, but as I was never out with Mr. Darwin alone, and as Lee generally accompanied us, I felt I was doing no wrong, and that he was very inconsiderate to feel that way. The real trouble started on the 6th of October, when I broke the setting of my engagement ring. I was afraid Lee would think I had been very careless, and I decided to have the ring mended, and to say nothing about it. When Mr. Darwin came in unexpectedly that evening, with plans for introducing me to an eminent playwright, he noticed that I wasn't wearing the ring, and asked why. I explained the circumstances, and asked him to give me the name of a reliable jeweler, whereupon he offered to take it himself to Tiffany's. "I had no suspicions of him," she said, with an appealing glance for her indiscretion. "I gave him the ring." She rested her voice as she sipped some more of the broth, which I brought up at McKelvie's request. "The next morning about 10 o'clock, Lee came to Gramercy Park. His face was pale and his eyes gleaming wildly. He called me names and accused me of a liaison with his uncle, telling me that I might have saved myself the trouble of returning the ring, as he did not want it. Then, vowing he would kill his uncle before the day was over, he dashed out, leaving me terrified, cowed. But not for long. When I realized Philip Darwin's perfidy, I determined to avenge myself for the aspersions he had cast upon my honor. I recalled that Lee had declared that one of Mr. Darwin's assertions had been that I was going to the house on Riverside Drive that night. Very well. I would keep the appointment, and I would tell him I was coming, meeting guile with guile. I phoned his office and asked him whether my ring was ready for me. In a voice as false as his heart, he apologized for not having taken it as yet to Tiffany's, but said he would return it to me, if I so desired, at dinner time, when he hoped to have the privilege of taking me to the Ritz. I pleaded a previous engagement, and asked him to let me come out to the house that afternoon to get the ring. He debated a while, and then said that it was locked up in his study, and as he would not be home until late it would be impossible for me to come for it. I said that the lateness of the hour didn't matter, that I must have the ring, for if Lee should learn where it was he would break off the engagement. He inquired if I had seen Lee, and I said, not today, but he was asking for it last night, and I put him off with an excuse. Then he said, all right, that I could come to the house at 11:15. I wanted to know if there wasn't a window or some other way for me to enter, because I didn't want his wife and servants to know of my call. He laughed and said that I had only to use the secret entrance and no one would be the wiser. He explained how to find it and said he'd leave the doors unlocked for me. I had fully intended being at the Darwin house at 10:45, but in thinking the matter over I became frightened. My anger had exhausted itself, and I was horrified at my own thoughts. I decided not to go. When 10:30 struck, however, the memory of all my wrongs swept over me again, coupled with the thought that Lee had threatened to kill his uncle also. I must get there before my lover, since it was all my fault that he was planning murder. Yet even in my haste I took occasion to lay my plans with care. I would kill Darwin and myself, since Lee no longer cared for me. I wrote a confession and put it in my pocket, that I might leave it in Darwin's study, so that no one else need suffer for the crime. It was 11 when I came downstairs, and meeting my landlady, I informed her that I was going on a journey, and should anyone inquire for me, to say that she had no idea where I had gone. I took the subway to Dyckman Street, and walked from there to the Darwin home. I slipped into the grounds and around the house to the place where Mr. Darwin had told me there was a door in the masonry. I pushed against the wall, the door gave way, and I found myself at the bottom of a flight of stairs. I closed the door and then climbed the steps, feeling my way in the darkness until my hand came in contact with another door that yielded at my touch. I felt a carpet under my feet and knew I was in a room. I groped my way along until I reached an open space and collided with what I thought was a bar. I remembered that he had told me to stoop when I passed through the safe. When I straightened up, I saw that I was in his study and that the lamp on his table was lighted. At the end of the table sat Philip Darwin, asleep. I advanced toward him, taking out my automatic as I walked. When I was close to him, I pointed the pistol at him, then staggered back in horror, just as the lamp went out. There was a blood stain on his shirt front. Someone had reached him ahead of me. In the darkness I fled from him in a panic of fear, thrusting my pistol into the bosom of my dress. Then realizing that I had gone in the wrong direction, I ran back again, straight into the arms of a man. Before I could scream he had flung a cloth over my head and carried me to a couch. How long I remained thus I don't know, but just when I thought I must suffocate, someone removed the cloth, a glass was held to my lips, and Lee said gently, "Drink this and you'll feel better, dear." I thought he had rescued me. I drained the glass. Then I tried to ask where I was, but my head began to feel queer and heavy, and my tongue refused its office. I closed my eyes and slipped into a dreamless sleep. When I awoke I could still feel the couch beneath me. I got up and groped my way around until I encountered the light switch. Then I saw that I was in a small carpeted room which was furnished only with a divan and a smoking stand. At either end of the room were doors. One of these was locked, but the other had been left partly open and gave egress on the stairs that I had climbed. I thought of going down again, but felt too shaky to risk it, and returned again to the divan, deciding that I was in the room I had crossed to enter the study by the safe. There was a beautiful Persian cover on the couch, and idly I examined it, lifting it clear off the floor. Then it was that I saw something bright shining where the fringe of the cover had swept the floor. I picked up the object and saw that it was a ring, Dick Trenton's ring. I knew it was his, she added, her pale cheeks flushing, because when he proposed to me he wanted to take it off and put it on my finger. I gazed on the ring for a long time, trying to solve the mystery into which I had stumbled. Philip Darwin was dead, I was evidently a prisoner, and Dick's ring was in this room. If he had killed Mr. Darwin, it was only right that he should pay the penalty. I would keep the ring, and when the police found me, if someone else was in prison for the crime, I would give them the ring and tell them what I knew. I still felt very drowsy, so I put out the light, and as I lay down again the thought occurred to me that if Dick should come back while I slept and found the ring in my possession, he would take it away from me. Hastily I conceived a plan. I tied the ring to the fringe of the cover, where it would remain hidden until I could make use of it. I was dozing off when a step on the stairs aroused me. Someone came into the room. "Dick?" I asked tentatively. He laughed oddly and replied, "No, not Dick, Lee," and I felt his arms around me and his kisses on my face. I was bewildered. Lee? Why had he drugged me then? "Lee," I cried, "why am I here?" "It's all right, dear. Uncle Phil was murdered, and they think you did it." "But I didn't kill him," I protested, sitting up and pushing him away. "He was dead when I entered the room." "I know," he answered, "but just the same the police are hunting you. That's why I hid you away." I heard him moving about the room, then he came back to me and said, "You must be thirsty. Drink this." But I was not going to be drugged a second time if I could help it, police or no police, so I said, "I'm not thirsty, Lee." "That doesn't matter. Drink, I tell you. I'm in a hurry." His voice took on a sinister note as he held the glass forcibly to my lips. I gave his hand a shove, spilling the contents of the glass over him. "You she-devil!" he said, and crushed me to him. Then he flung the cloth over my head again and almost strangled me. I felt him lift me in his arms and carry me up a flight of steps. He placed me on the floor of a room and went away. I was in that room a long, long time before he came again. I was thirsty and hungry and heart-sore to think that he would treat me so, for the room was narrow and bare, and I hadn't even a bed to lie upon. My only comfort lay in the fact that my revolver still reposed where I had placed it. I took it out and held it in my hand, for I no longer trusted him. The second time he came to see me, he opened the panel that formed the door to my cell, and I could see his figure silhouetted against the dim light in the further room. "Lee!" I exclaimed, "why, oh why have you done this? Is it because you killed your uncle and are afraid that I will tell what I know?" He did not answer, and I went on, "Why didn't you listen to my explanation that morning? You would have known then that your uncle only took the ring to have it mended. I do not know what he told you, but whatever it was, he lied." "Did he lie about your coming to see him?" he replied then, in a hard voice. "Did he? Answer me that when I saw you enter his study." "Yes, he lied," I returned. "I came to kill him and myself for his perfidy. Only you had already shot him. Oh, Lee, Lee, why didn't you listen to my explanation?" "I don't believe you. You came because he asked you to, but I got him first. And now your turn has come." He made as if to step toward me, and I put the pistol to my breast. "If you come any nearer, Lee, I'll kill myself," I said steadily. "Oh, to think that I could ever have loved you, you murderer!" He drew back. "You'll pay for this. When you have starved for a couple of weeks you'll be more amenable, I guess." And he went away laughing. I was horrified, and I lay and wept for hours. Then as I moved about I discovered a jug of water. For a long time I was afraid to touch it, fearing it was a trap to catch me, but when my thirst got the better of my judgment, I drank just enough to satisfy my worst craving. I waited to learn the results, and as I remained clear-headed I decided the water was pure and hoarded it with care. I came to the conclusion that jealousy and its consequences had made Lee mad, and that he was not responsible for his actions. Instead of horror, pity filled my heart, for I loved him still. He did not come near me again until tonight, and then he was more fiendish than ever. He said he must leave the city, that he would come back for me tomorrow night, and I could then make my choice between going with him and death. He pressed a button and showed me a yawning hole in the middle of the floor, telling me that he would throw me down into the pit below before he would let me go free to relate to the police what had happened to me. Oh, it was dreadful! I was glad when he was gone. I knew that nothing on earth could induce me to go with him, but the thought of falling through that black hole was more than I could bear. As long as I had to die, I would choose a less harrowing way. I took out my pistol and was just going to kill myself when you flung up the barrel and rescued me." She gave McKelvie a tremulous smile and burst into tears. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Mystery of the Hidden Room. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mystery of the Hidden Room by Marion HARVEY. Chapter 36. The Trap. For a space there was silence in the room while McKelvie paced the floor, a worried crease between his brows. As for Jones and myself, we looked from the girl to one another in undisguised perplexity. How was it possible for Lee Darwin, whom we had rescued from the hands of the criminal at Hai Ling's shop, to be the same person who had kept Cora Manning a prisoner? Or had the boy been merely pretending to be unconscious, and the old man had been a confederate in the game which they were playing to trap McKelvie? Yet the doctor had said that Lee was really ill, and the doctor could not possibly have any motive for lying, since he had been called in by Jones and was a stranger to us. Again, Cora had said that Lee had come to see her just previous to our rescue of her, and at that time I can swear to it that he was upstairs in one of the rooms in McKelvie's house. Of course, there was always the chance that the young man we had saved was not Lee Darwin at all, though who else he could be I had no idea, for I had only seen him once the day of the inquest, and the others had never laid eyes on him before. To counterbalance that hypothesis, however, was the straightforward story he had told, which tallied point for point with Cora's account. There was some deep mystery here which I, for one, could not fathom. "My dear child," said McKelvie presently, from his tone one would have judged him old enough to be her father, "are you sure that you did not dream this tale?" "Dream it? Oh, no! It was too horribly real for me to have dreamt it," she answered, astonished that he should doubt her. "I was not referring to the treatment you had received, but to Lee Darwin's connection with your incarceration," he explained. "At the time of which you speak, Lee was himself a prisoner in Chinatown, and to-night he is at my home, ill in bed, too ill to have been able to come here at all." "Lee a prisoner? Lee at your house, ill? How can that be?" she asked in wondering tones. "Miss Manning, did you see this man's face so that you could swear to it?" continued McKelvie earnestly. "No. It was dark when he spoke to me in the little room, and up here the light behind him was always dim. But I heard his voice, Mr. McKelvie. I could swear it was Lee's," she insisted. "Voices are easily imitated. He did not talk to you for any great length of time, and he was careful that you should not see his face too closely. If he had been Lee, he would not have cared how much you saw his features." McKelvie laid a hand on the girl's arm as he added, "I want you to believe that Lee had nothing to do with this affair. On the contrary, he has done his best to protect you, almost giving his life for your sake. Let me tell you his story briefly. He can fill in the details for you later." And he told her of our trip to Hai Ling's shop. "I'm so glad," she said, raising tear-filled eyes to his face as he ended. "You see, I love him still, even though I thought him all that was bad. May I see him soon?" "Yes, but I'm going to ask you to remain in this house to-night. You are not strong enough yet to make a journey in the subway, and I have no desire to use the phone to call a taxi. The criminal may have a means of tapping the wire for all we know. Now, Miss Manning, are you sure he is coming back tomorrow?" "Yes, he told me he would return tomorrow night. He said he had to get money enough for our trip in case I should go with him, and that a woman always needed plenty of spare cash. Besides, he'd be sure to come, if only to give me my choice. He would not leave me here alive for someone to discover. He made that very plain to me," she returned with a shudder. "Very well, then. We will meet him in your place. I'm going to guard you to-night myself, in case he should change his mind and come again unexpectedly. In the meantime, I wish that you, Mr. Davies, would spend the night at my house to protect Lee. And if you will come around to Stuyvesant Square at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, Jones, I'll give you the other details necessary to catch the murderer in his own little trap." "Do you want a taxi for tomorrow, then?" asked Jones as we were leaving. "Yes, send one around about 9 o'clock. Tell him to wait at the corner of Dyckman and Broadway. Or, better yet, send one of your own men with the car, in order that there may be no hitch in our plans." Jones promised, and we returned to town via the subway, and parted company at Union Square. When I reached McKelvie's house, I stopped at Lee's room, and found that he was awake. He called to me to know whether I had any news, so I told him the latest developments, watching his face while I talked. He listened eagerly to what I had to say, was unaffectedly glad of the girl's release, and thankful to learn that she was safe. His face darkened when I spoke of the impersonation, and he was just as much at a loss as myself to account for it. When I turned in, I had come to one conclusion at least, and that was that Lee had had no hand in the murder, either as principal or as confederate. At 10 o'clock the next morning Jones put in an appearance, but McKelvie had not yet returned, so we occupied ourselves with a discussion of the events of the previous night. Finally, we came to the conclusion that Cora Manning, in her dazed state, had perhaps mistaken Dick for Lee, since both were more or less of a height. But in that event, Dick purposely misled her. Why? What reason could he have for such an action, unless, indeed, his love for her, coupled with the crime committed in a moment of passionate anger against the man who had injured him, had turned his brain? When McKelvie arrived, he brought Cora Manning with him, and asked me to conduct her to Lee. I helped her up the stairs and to the room where Lee was sitting, and as he rose and held out his arms to her, I turned away and went back downstairs, where McKelvie was issuing his orders to Jones. "I want you to bring 3 men to the house with you, Jones. Be out there at 5 o'clock and get Mason to let you in the back way. Wait in the passageway for me. Get Grenville to accompany you. Tell him it's important." "You think you'll be able to catch him?" inquired Jones as he picked up his hat. "He has no suspicion of our visit last night. Our rescue of Lee, although in a measure it proves that Mrs. Darwin had nothing to do with the crime, does not, in his opinion, help us to locate Cora. He only kept Lee at Hi Ling's to prevent him from giving evidence in Mrs. Darwin's behalf. He will come to the house tonight without the least suspicion that there will be anyone there to greet him as he deserves." And McKelvie laughed. "Then you know who he is?" I inquired as Jones left the house. "I still suspect. I shall not know positively until tonight. And now I'm going to get some sleep. Then we will go over to Darwin's bank. I have a mind to see whether that $150,000 is still there." Taking advantage of the respite, I went back to my own apartments for luncheon, and returned to Stuyvesant Square in my car. Evidently, in McKelvie's mind, Cunningham was still under suspicion, yet I could hardly credit that it was Cunningham who had kept the girl a prisoner. He did not resemble Lee. When we arrived at the bank, Mr. Trenton turned us over to Raines, who conducted us to the safe deposit vault. "Do you know whether Cunningham was in today?" asked McKelvie. "No, I don't. One of the tellers might be able to tell you," responded Raines. "Never mind. The strong box will tell me all I want to know," McKelvie answered. We approached Cunningham's box, and Raines inserted his key in the lock. As he pulled it open, I leaned closer to look at the interior. Then I gave an exclamation of astonishment. The box was empty. The $150,000 in bills was gone. It was 2 days ago that we had interviewed Cunningham, and he did not then contemplate removing the money from the bank. What had occasioned this sudden need for so much cash? I could think of only one reason. His must be the mastermind that had conceived the crime and struck the blow against Darwin, even though he had since hired confederates to aid him in his scheme of holding Cora, as he had done in the case of Lee. I spoke my thought to McKelvie as we drove back to his home, but he shook his head. "The criminal had no confederates to aid him against the girl. He has played a lone hand all through, with one exception, that is, in the case of Lee." "Then why did he remove that money from the bank?" I asked. "Perhaps he is going on that trip he was telling us about the other night," responded McKelvie cynically, and I knew by his tone that he himself did not believe any such thing. "A trip which will end before it has begun, since it's very apparent his only reason for flight must be that he killed Philip Darwin," I said with a laugh. "Oh, no," responded McKelvie coolly. "He is clever and unprincipled, and all kinds of a blackguard, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if he had a couple of murders to his name. But this I do know. He did not murder Philip Darwin." End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of The Mystery of the Hidden Room. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mystery of the Hidden Room by Marion HARVEY. Chapter 37. McKelvie's Triumph. When we drove into the grounds of the Darwin home at 5 o'clock that night, McKelvie ordered me to hide my car behind the garage, and then to join him in the passageway. As I obeyed, I saw him helping Lee, with Cora's aid, to mount the steps to the back door, for he wanted the two of them for purposes of identification, since both had been victims of the unprincipled man we had come there tonight to try to trap. I parked my car where it could not be seen by anyone approaching the house, and then returned to the servants' wing and entered the passageway, where McKelvie was disposing of his forces. The 3 burly policemen that Jones had brought with him, McKelvie ordered to remain where they were until it grew dark, when they were to hide themselves in the grounds, toward the side of the house. When they saw a light in the study, they were then to group themselves around the door to the secret entrance, which he had already pointed out to one of the number while I was parking my car. If anyone came out through this door, they were to arrest that person, and under no circumstances to let him get away, even if they had to shoot him. The men saluted, and I could see by the determination written on their faces that the criminal would have small chance of escaping their vigilance. Then McKelvie opened the door into the main wing and asked Cora and Lee to remain in Orton's workroom until they were needed. "And under no circumstances show a light of any kind," he added. They did not need to promise, for they preferred a darkened room in which to tell each other the sweet nothings that lovers are fond of murmuring, and I envied them their happiness, as I thought of Ruth shut away where even my loving care could not reach her. In the fading daylight the study was dim, but we managed to make out the outlines of the furniture, and so were able to move about without turning on the lamp. McKelvie grouped some chairs around the table and told us to seat ourselves, since at that distance we could not be seen by the criminal as he stepped from the safe. Then McKelvie arranged the shades, drawing them so that they did not quite reach the bottom of the windows, thus allowing the light to gleam through later, as a signal to the waiting policeman. When everything was ready, McKelvie spoke to us in an undertone. "I do not know how long we shall have to wait for him. He will come when it is dark, perhaps, and again he may not turn up until midnight. In any event, whether our vigil be long or short, I want to impress upon you the necessity for absolute silence. A false move and we may lose every advantage, and the criminal as well." We declared ourselves ready to obey his instructions, however long we might have to wait, and he crossed the room and took up his position beside the safe door with the metal handcuffs in his hand, prepared to snap them on the wrists of the man who should come forth from the entrance. I glanced at Jones and Grenville, and saw to my amusement that the police detective was sound asleep. He reminded me of a watchdog that, though he might doze, would yet be instantly on the alert at the least hint of danger. The district attorney caught my look and smiled. Then he leaned back in his chair and set himself to wait with what patience he might possess. I turned to my thoughts, thankful that McKelvie had spared Mr. Trenton this ordeal, for now that Cunningham was exonerated, the burden of the crime must fall upon Dick, who, after all, was the only one well enough acquainted with circumstances to have attempted the schemes which McKelvie had foiled. Yet it seemed such a mad thing to do, to put his head in the noose a second time when he had just been cleared of his first crime, unless James Gilmore's story was all of a piece with the other deceptions Dick had practiced upon us. Who was Gilmore, anyway? Had we any proof that his story was true? He may have been paid to put us off the scent by making us believe that Dick could not commit another crime since he was innocent of the first one. But, again, there was McKelvie's statement that with the exception of the Chinamen and those two ruffians, the criminal had steered clear of confederates. I could not divine Dick's motive for the deed, since the murder was not and never had been one of impulse. I wished heartily that the whole thing was over and this suspense ended, yet when the lamp suddenly lighted on the table and I knew that the hour was at hand, since it must have been the criminal's hand that had pressed the switch in the safe, I closed my eyes. I did not want to see the door swing open and Dick step out of that safe. I heard a metallic click as McKelvie snapped on the handcuffs, and I opened my eyes with a start as I realized by the snarl of rage that had come from the murderer's lips that we had caught the man as neatly as one traps a wild and dangerous animal. McKelvie laughed as he slammed the door of the safe, and the three of us rose precipitately. Jones had wakened when the lamp went on, for we could make out the criminal's figure as he came rapidly toward us. When he stood within the circle of light, confronting the muzzle of Jones's gun, I looked into his face, then I gasped audibly. The man before me was not Dick, but the lawyer, Cunningham. "This is an outrage!" he exclaimed furiously. "What do you mean by putting such an indignity upon me?" And he glared at McKelvie. McKelvie smiled in an exasperating manner. "I was expecting the criminal to come through that entrance, since he alone possesses a key to it. I saw a man appear and clapped on the bracelets. It happened to be you. How do you explain the circumstance?" he inquired politely. "Very easily," retorted Cunningham coolly, recovering his poise. "I was going over a lot of old papers and came across a sealed envelope addressed to me in Darwin's hand. Wondering what it could portend, I opened it. Inside I found a small key and the explanation of the secret of the entrance. Darwin also went on to say that he was taking me into his confidence in case anything should ever happen to him. Having a fondness for amateur detective work, like yourself, Mr. McKelvie," here he bowed ironically to McKelvie, "I decided to use the opportunity which fate had bestowed upon me to do a little investigating on my own account." "Very ingenious, but it won't do," returned McKelvie, adding with a sarcastic inflection, "I suppose he also told you the 6-letter combination that I used to lock the safe after he was dead?" Cunningham flushed and bit his lip, but before he could think of an appropriate retort, McKelvie had turned to Jones. "You won't need to use that gun, Jones," he said with a twinkle. "Our prisoner is too valuable to shoot, as yet. Call in the others, please, and light the room as you pass the switch." Jones pocketed his gun and departed on his errand, lighting the study, as we had agreed to do, for the guidance of the men outside. In a second he was back again, with Lee and Cora. As Cunningham's eyes rested on the girl, who had her arm around Lee and was helping him tenderly to a chair, the man's face darkened and his eyes blazed upon her. "Miss Manning, have you ever seen this man before?" asked McKelvie when Lee was seated and Cora had turned toward us. The girl looked Cunningham up and down, from the sole of his patent leather shoes to the crown of his gray-streaked red hair, then she shook her head and answered simply, "No, Mr. McKelvie, I have never seen him before." "Now I trust that you are satisfied?" demanded Cunningham insolently, a gleam of triumph in his eyes. "You will oblige me by removing these things?" Though he held out his manacled hands to McKelvie, his eyes remained on Cora's face with a look impossible to mistake. The man was in love with her, though how that was possible when she did not know him, I was at a loss to decide. McKelvie took a step forward, and I thought he was going to comply with Cunningham's request, but he made no move to release his prisoner. "Sorry to have to refuse a gentleman of your standing, but you are far safer to me with the bracelets on," returned McKelvie imperturbably. "You are undoubtedly clever, or you could not have evaded me so long, but the trouble with you, as it is with all clever criminals, is that you are egotistical. You commit a crime and get away with it, and then you immediately think yourself a genius, so much more wonderful than your fellows who have paid the penalty for their deeds, so infinitely superior to the police and the detectives that you have no fear of being caught. But, like all your class, there is a weak joint in your armor. There is no such thing as an infallible criminal and a perfect crime. You may get away once, or perhaps a score of times, but in the end your weakness trips you, and you fall into the hands of the authorities. In your case, the thing that tripped you and delivered you to us was love for a woman. A dangerous game to play, the woman game, Mr. Cunningham, but love knows no reason. You were so desperately infatuated with Cora Manning that the thought of going away and leaving her to a more successful rival was agony to you, and so you remained to persuade her to go with you. That is why you are here now, facing arrest under an accusation of murder." In wondering silence we listened to McKelvie's words, and Cora said quickly, "In love with me? But I never saw him before." Cunningham only smiled coolly. "You have no proof, my dear sir, no proof at all." "Haven't I? I am not as amateurish as I look," said McKelvie dryly. Then he faced the man before him squarely, and addressed him in a tone of grim earnestness from which all hint of banter had fled. "You demand proofs. I will give them to you. I know why the murder was committed, why Mrs. Darwin was implicated, because I know exactly what took place in this room on the night of October 7th, from the moment when Richard Trenton stepped through that French window to the moment when the murderer left the room by the secret entrance. In other words, the game is up, Mr. Philip Darwin," and McKelvie's hand shot out toward his prisoner's face. I heard Lee's wondering, "Uncle Phil?" and unable to believe my ears, I took a second look. Then, "Good God!" I cried, for the red hair and beard were gone, and the man standing where Cunningham had been was indeed Ruth's husband, for whose murder she was even now enduring the horrors of prison life. Philip Darwin. But Philip Darwin without his eyeglasses and without his beard. Who, then, was the man we had found dead in this room, the man we had buried under Darwin's name? A sudden conviction born of McKelvie's last words flashed across my mind. "Was it—" I began. "Yes," replied McKelvie. "The man who was so foully murdered in this room that night was Richard Trenton." Cora cried out, "Dick! Oh, not Dick!" and I put my hand to my head, for my brain was in a whirl. Yet I was conscious of a feeling of thankfulness that he was the victim rather than the perpetrator of the crime. With a snarl of rage, Darwin broke from McKelvie's hand and fled toward the safe. Jones started to follow, but McKelvie checked him with a laugh. "Let him go, Jones. Have you forgotten that there are 3 men guarding the outer door?" he said. Darwin paused abruptly and turned a hate-distorted face toward us. Then he recovered his cool manner and walked back calmly to where we stood. "You win," he said to McKelvie with a shrug. "What do you want of me?" "If you will kindly be seated, I should like to explain, with your corroboration, just exactly what did take place in this room that night," answered McKelvie. "No," returned Darwin. "Let me tell the story, for you would bungle the tale. I'll accept your word that you know what happened, since otherwise you could not have unmasked me. Kindly take off those bracelets, they annoy me, and give me a cigar. I swear to you that I shall make no attempt to leave this room." For a long minute the 2 men looked into one another's eyes. Then McKelvie stepped forward and removed the handcuffs. He bestowed them in his pocket, took out a cigar, and offered it to Darwin. The man accepted the cigar with a bow, lighted it, and then, drawing a chair into the center of the circle which we had formed, he leaned back nonchalantly and began his tale. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of The Mystery of the Hidden Room. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mystery of the Hidden Room by Marion HARVEY. Chapter 38. The Motive. "You must know, then," said Philip Darwin, "that I was the child of a second marriage contracted between my father and a young woman who had just begun to earn a name for herself upon the stage. She endured 2 years of walking the straight and narrow path as his wife, and then she eloped with an actor friend. My father hushed the scandal and withdrew from social life, becoming morose and bitter and narrower than ever, watching over me with a zealous eye as I grew older, and endeavoring to eradicate the talents which I had inherited from her, looking with particular disfavor on my ability to act and mimic the speech of those about me. Knowing my inherited love of pleasures of all kinds, he strove to curb me by refusing to let me go out in the evenings with my young companions. This I considered an indignity, since I was then old enough to be my own master, and so I took matters into my own hand, retiring early and then sneaking away from my rooms to join my friends. This practice I continued until, by an unforeseen chance, I was among those arrested in a raid upon a gambling house. I would have given a false name, but unfortunately the sergeant knew me, and of course the affair came to the ears of my father. He was exceedingly wroth, and threatened to disinherit me if I ever disobeyed him again. I did not want to lose my chance to secure his fortune, which would come to me intact, since Robert, my older brother, was dead, and my sister, Leila, had run away from home, so I remained at home on my best behavior. It was just at this time that I came across an old book in the study that gave the history of the house from which ours had been copied. I investigated and found the door in the masonry, took an impression of the lock, had a key made, and so discovered the secret room. That room gave me an idea. I knew that it was next the study, although it had never been cut through, but this fact did not trouble me. My father had planned to take me to Europe with him, but I told him that I preferred to remain at home and look after the business, into which I had been taken as junior partner on my 21st birthday. Thinking that I had reformed, he gave his permission for me to have a safe built in the study, since I had pointed out to him that now I was a man of affairs I needed such a contrivance for my personal papers. But though he left for Europe without me, he did not altogether trust me, for I discovered that his lawyer had orders to telegraph my father if at any time he learned that I had deviated from the rule of conduct laid down for me to follow. I determined to outwit him. I sent Mason away, hired some workmen, had a door cut between the study and the secret room, and had a safe built into the wall as a blind. Then I spent the rest of the year in evolving the character of Cunningham. He should be a young law student, red-haired, red-bearded, fastidious. Also, as Darwin, I adopted glasses to make myself and Cunningham as opposite as possible in appearance. When my father returned, he heard no scandal of me, for Cunningham had taken young Darwin's place in the beau monde. Thereafter I had no difficulty in getting away, retiring early and then leaving the house by the secret entrance, after changing to Cunningham in the little room. After my father's death, Cunningham was of no further value to me, but I was too clever to utterly destroy him, since I had no idea when I might need him again. So he told his friends that a relative had died abroad, leaving him a fortune, and that he was going on a trip around the world. Then Darwin came back and took his place in the social world. I pass over the next few years, in which I played the fool and speculated beyond my means. 8 months ago I was in desperate need of money, although none knew of it, and I saw that my only course lay in marrying some wealthy woman. I looked around me and decided that Arthur Trenton's daughter would serve my purpose. I made friends with her brother and discovered to my annoyance that the young lady in question had just engaged herself to a young broker by the name of Carlton Davies, and that the wedding was scheduled to take place in a very short time. This was something of a setback, since I knew that Miss Trenton was not likely to jilt her lover for a man she was barely acquainted with. But once I make up my mind to obtain a thing, I never give up until that thing is mine. I cast about for a way to make her marry me, and having cultivated her brother, Dick, for a month, I laid my plans accordingly. I enticed the boy, who was inclined to be wild, to a gambling den, after I had taken the trouble to get him fairly intoxicated. I had hired a jailbird to quarrel with Dick, and when the man pretended to go for the boy, I shot and killed him, telling Dick that he had done it. He became frightened, and I took him to his home, where his father was told my version of the tale, and Dick was dispatched to Chicago. Then I forced Ruth to marry me to save her brother from going to the chair for something he had never done. Darwin paused in his narrative to puff his cigar, and to let us sufficiently admire the cleverness that had conceived such a plan. Admire! I could only shudder at the thought that there could be in existence a man who could carry out such diabolical schemes in cold blood, and actually pride himself on his accomplishment. After the marriage, I made Ruth sign away her dower rights as well as her dowry, all to save her brother. Then I took up my old way of living again. But now there was a fly in the ointment. People began to talk, and I had enough of my father in me to make gossip distasteful to me. Yet marriage was a bore, I discovered, and so I resurrected the lawyer, Cunningham. If as Darwin I must endure life with Ruth, as Cunningham I would be as gay as I chose. I hired an apartment and began my double life. When Darwin was bored to distraction by prosaic affairs, he would take a business trip, and Cunningham would have his fling. When pleasures cloyed, Cunningham would be off to see his out-of-town clients, and Darwin would return to the city. The excitement and the danger of detection that this sort of existence afforded fascinated me, and I should have kept it up indefinitely if fate in the person of a former teller of the Darwin Bank had not intervened. This man, James Gilmore, who had been my dupe 10 years before, and had since been in jail, was at the gambling den the night I shot Combs, and he realized the trick I had played upon Dick. I thought at the time when Gilmore fell that I had killed him also. I did not know him at the time. I merely shot at him on the principle that dead men tell no awkward tales. But by some freak of chance he escaped unhurt and became acquainted with Richard Trenton. The first intimation I had that my plans had gone awry was in a letter from Dick explaining the circumstances. I thought the matter over and finally made up my mind to go to Chicago as Cunningham, to kill Dick, and then return as Darwin, abolishing forever the character of the lawyer. When I reached Chicago, however, and saw Dick, a new plan, more daring, more subtle, more pleasing in every way, leaped fully matured into my mind, since by means of it Darwin would disappear and Cunningham would remain, free to live his life unhampered by the marriage tie. Dick had grown a beard. Trim it as mine was trimmed, give him a pair of old eyeglasses, and he could pass superficially for myself. I marveled at the likeness then. Now I know it was only natural, since it seems he was my nephew as well as my brother-in-law. I pretended as the lawyer to be on his side, returned to New York, and wrote him a letter in which I declared that as Ruth refused to divorce me, which was one of the terms of reparation Dick insisted upon, he had better call upon me and talk things over. He walked into the trap I had laid for him, and telegraphed that he would come to see me. Again Darwin paused and eyed us in that strange, exultant manner. "You will think, perhaps, that it was a daring thing to do, this that I had in mind, but its very audacity would serve to carry it through, I knew. Have you ever studied psychology? I commend it to you, for my knowledge of that subject was the foundation stone upon which I built. When a man is found shot in his own study, remaking his own will, looking like himself to all outward appearance, the conclusion is naturally that the dead man is the one whom the world believes him to be, that is, the master of the house. Also, I had no fear that the deception would be remarked. Orton was nearsighted. Mr. Davies, for as I shall show you presently, I intended to bring him into this affair also, knew me only slightly, had not seen Dick for 6 months, and never with a beard, besides being under the belief that the boy was in Chicago, and Ruth would be too overwrought to notice anything amiss. The only one I really feared was Lee, as he knew me thoroughly. I determined to get rid of him. The question was, how? And the answer was supplied by the girl, Cora Manning. I had been intrigued by her beauty, but had no thought, despite my nephew's assertions, beyond being allowed to gaze upon her occasionally. But the night of the 6th, as she told me of her broken ring, I knew I loved her and wanted her for my own. I saw a way ahead of me and seized the opportunity presented to me. I inveigled her into giving me the ring, and the next morning I gave Lee to understand that the girl had been false to him. He believed me, and I knew him well enough to guess that he would break off the engagement, leaving the way free for me later. I also ordered him to leave my house for his insolence to me, thus getting him out of the way for that night. It was at this point in the game that a new element was introduced. I had meant merely to leave Ruth a supposed widow, but when Orton showed me the letter she had written to her former lover, I determined to make her pay for my crime. I told him to piece the letter together and bring it to me, and then I left for the office. And now I was guilty of my first error. I permitted my infatuation for Cora to get the better of my discretion, and told her to come to the house at 10:45, knowing I would have time to see her in the secret entrance and get rid of her before Dick was scheduled to arrive. I should have known better, for it was too dangerous a game to play. At 10:30 that night, I called Ruth to the study and upbraided her, threatening Mr. Davies in such terms that she took fright and declared she would send for him to warn him. I only laughed, and thoroughly roused, she left me to call her lover to her, as I hoped she would. Then I locked the study door, opened the secret entrance, as I had promised, and waited for Cora. She did not come, and when 11 struck I gave her up, and was on the point of leaving the study to relock the entrance, when Dick suddenly stepped in through the window, 1/2 hour before he was due. We talked for 25 minutes, while I waited for Mr. Davies' arrival. Dick insisted upon seeing Ruth at once. I told him she had gone out with friends and would not return until 11:30. At 11:25 I heard a motor drive up, and guessing it must be Mr. Davies who had come, I set to work to carry out my plan. I told Dick Ruth had come, and he sprang up and went to the door. I followed him, and as I did so I soaked a handkerchief with chloroform from a bottle I had in my pocket, and as he fumbled with the key, I came up behind him and pressed the handkerchief over his face. As he sagged into my arms, I switched off the light and carried him to the secret room, depositing him on the couch. Then I returned to the study, unlocked the door, and called in Orton that he might take away with him a mental image of myself seated in my chair, as I later intended that Dick would sit. When Orton was gone, I relocked the door and returned to Dick. I exchanged clothing with him, and it was no easy task, for he lay an inert mass. Then I trimmed his beard and placed my eyeglasses on his nose. Finally I took out my revolver and shot him through the heart, as I supposed, but he had come out from under the influence of the anesthetic, and as I fired, he moved so that the bullet only penetrated his lung. I knew that he was done for in any case, and as I bent down to pick him up I noticed the ring on his finger. I never wore rings, and that one was too familiar to Ruth to risk leaving it. I was removing it with care when I heard a step on the stairs of the entrance. I remembered Cora and dared not let her guess the truth. Hastily I snatched off the ring, slipped it in my pocket, and carried Dick into the study, setting him down in my chair. Then I hid behind the curtains of the window, which was nearest the safe. I saw her enter, and as she advanced toward the table where only the lamp was lighted, I slipped into the safe and switched it off. I took off my coat, and as she fell against me in the dark, I flung it over her head, and carried her to the divan in the secret room. Then I went about my other business, for I had much to do. I cleaned my gun and recharged it, removing the bullet from the cartridge I intended to fire later. I returned to the study, pushed back the chair so that it would look as though Darwin had been shot when he rose to meet someone, arranged the matter of the wills, and left a word half finished upon the testament I was supposed to have been making, burning the old one which I had torn up when I recalled it was in Lee's favor and not Ruth's. When I saw that I had bruised Dick's finger, I flung Cora's ring, from which the stone had dropped that morning, on the top shelf of the safe in order to explain the abrasion with some degree of plausibility, since I knew that Lee had seen the ring on my finger in the morning. Then, when everything was as perfect as human ingenuity could make it, I went to the door and unlocked it, that Ruth might find no obstacle to her entrance. I switched on the lights for a moment for a last survey and saw a handkerchief lying near the door. When I picked it up I saw that it was Ruth's, but caution prevailed, and I smelled it to make sure, knowing well that Cora used Rose Jacqueminot, since I had adopted it myself after becoming acquainted with her. The handkerchief was unscented, and I decided to add it to the evidence against Ruth. I put out the light, stained the handkerchief with blood, arranged it in Dick's hand, turned out the lamp, and waited for Ruth. How did I know she would come to the study? Because I had decoyed Mr. Davies to the house to bring about that very result. He was a man, and he loved her, and he feared what I might do to her if I remained in possession of that letter. I had purposely told her I was going out, and had let her see me throw the letter in the table drawer. Mr. Davies, I knew, would urge her to get the letter. When she came in and I heard her fumbling with the contents of the drawer, I fired my revolver. I knew it would startle her, and that she would move away from the table, so I slung the gun along the carpet, trusting that it would carry as far as her feet. Then I hastened to the safe and turned on the lamp, closing the door to behind me, but remaining where I could hear what occurred in the study. I heard Mr. Davies' order to Orton, and locking the safe I hastened through the entrance to the front door, letting myself in just as they disappeared into Ruth's apartments. I went into the dining room and opened a bottle of wine, into which I mixed a sleeping potion. While I was there, I heard the doctor arrive and go upstairs, then I returned the way I had come, poured out a glass of the wine and gave it to Cora. Then I locked the entrance doors and left her there to sleep while I returned to the Corinth as Dick, so that there would be no undue search made for him. The next morning I went back to my apartments as Cunningham, and from there to the inquest. When Ruth had been adjudged guilty, I determined to get rid of Lee, since his actions told me plainly he knew something of Cora's visit. I decoyed him from the club with a fake message and had him kidnapped, but could get nothing from him. I decided to keep him a prisoner until after Ruth had paid the penalty for the crime. My thought now reverted to Cora, but I dared not return to the house that night, as the police were still in charge. I waited until they had left about 9 o'clock the next morning, and went to the secret room, where I found Cora awake. It was too risky a matter to take her to my other apartments. Besides, she knew too much to suit me, so I impersonated Lee to kill her love for him. Then as Cunningham, I would rescue her, and through her gratitude I could earn her love. I did not guess she had a revolver, or things might have taken a different turn. The afternoon of the 9th I carried out the plans for the suicide of Richard Trenton. It was necessary to account for his disappearance, since 2 men were gone and there was only one body which could be produced. It was I who jumped in the river. It was an unpleasant duty, but I had to make some sacrifice to attain my ends. I swam down the shore and made my way to Chinatown to my refuge at Hai Ling's. From then on I faced the world as Cunningham, and in the end I should have triumphed, but for one thing. Mr. Davies' refusal to believe Ruth guilty brought a new element into the case, a man with brains as keen as my own, who was not to be duped as I had fooled the police. He was suspicious of Cunningham from the first, but I did not think that even he could uncover the truth, so in the end I lost. Darwin ceased speaking, and there was silence in the room for a moment. Then unexpectedly he rose and turned to McKelvie. "You are clever, but you haven't got me yet. You think to try me. The man doesn't live who can put me in a cell." Even as he spoke, before we could grasp the meaning of his rapidly uttered words, he sprang down the room toward the door, wrenching it open as Jones fired. We saw Darwin make for the stairs, and we were after him in a second. On the floor above he rushed into his dressing room, and as we entered we saw him disappear into the secret closet. There was a whirring sound and a cry of dismay, then silence, horror-filled. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of The Mystery of the Hidden Room. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mystery of the Hidden Room by Marion HARVEY. Chapter 39. Conclusion. Leaving Jones in charge of the house and its gruesome burden, McKelvie, Grenville, and I drove to Center Street to secure Ruth's release. On the way, Grenville asked McKelvie whether he would mind explaining how he first divined the truth. McKelvie obligingly complied. "I owe my success to Miss Manning's quick-wittedness in leaving us that clue in the secret room. But for that, the case might still be hanging fire. Until we discovered the ring, I had no suspicions of the real truth of the matter. I merely mistrusted Cunningham because he was the only clever, unprincipled person connected with the case, but I could conceive of no plausible motive which would cause him to commit the crime. I had never swallowed that neat account of how Darwin's finger came to be bruised. The reason was deeper than mere sentiment, I felt. When we stumbled on the ring, the truth flashed across my mind. The ring had to be removed because the dead man was Dick, not Darwin. If that were so, then Dick could not have committed suicide. I determined to test my theory. I took with me to Water Street a photograph of Darwin taken when he was Dick's age. I had seen it in an old album in the den upstairs when I first examined the house on Riverside Drive. Both Mrs. Bates and Ben Kite recognized it as the picture of the man who had jumped into the river. So far, so good. Dick had been murdered and Darwin was alive. What was the motive? James Gilmore supplied the answer and the case was simplified. With Darwin as the murderer, every fact fell into place with the case of a carefully pieced puzzle. Darwin wanted to rid himself of his wife. Darwin knew she had written a love letter. Darwin knew that Mr. Davies was in the house, and would urge Mrs. Darwin to secure the epistle. Also, the quarrel with Lee took on a new phase, a scheme for ridding himself of a pair of keen eyes. The only question to be solved was the one, where was Darwin? Was he still in the city or had he left the country? I could not rid myself of the idea that Cunningham had some share in the affair. He was too keenly interested to be a mere onlooker. Could it be that Cunningham was Darwin, I asked myself. I investigated and discovered that the two men were never in the city at the same time, that they had never been seen together, although they were more than lawyer and client. The finding of the $150,000 in Cunningham's strong box clinched the matter for me. I knew that Darwin was not likely to give another man the money which he would need himself with which to get away. McKelvie paused and turned to me. Do you remember the night he told us that pleasant fiction about the $150,000? I was positive then that he was Darwin, but I had no way of proving it, and I had no desire to put him on his guard. That is why I advertised for Lee. I wanted to frighten him into thinking I was on to him, and so catch him with the goods, which we were able to do, thanks to his own folly. "And thanks to you, Mrs. Darwin's life has been saved," I said as he ceased speaking. "I can never repay you for what you have done," and I held out my hand. He grasped it with an embarrassed laugh. "Don't thank me. I enjoyed running him to earth. I'm glad he got his deserts." "Did he really mean to kill himself?" I asked presently. "No. I examined that closet. It had a double purpose. There was a trap door in the ceiling as well, and when you pressed a button in the wall, a ladder was let down and you could escape over the roof. That was Darwin's plan, but in his haste he touched the wrong spring, for they were near together and it was dark, and so he fell to his death. Thus is evil punished in the end." "How did Cunningham happen to have a sachet bag embroidered with his initials, when Cora did not know him as Cunningham?" I inquired. "He had foolishly preserved the one she had given him as Darwin. The initials on it were P.D." "You told me that when I learned the answers to those questions that I should know who committed the crime. Why was it then that Jones and I did not guess the truth the night we heard Lee's story?" "Because you had no idea of the motive for the crime. Also, you answered some of the questions wrong," he replied with a smile. "Wasn't it odd that Ruth failed to recognize Cunningham as her husband when he spoke to her at the inquest?" I asked. "No, he kept his voice disguised. Didn't he say he had a bad cold or something of the sort? When I was positive that Cunningham was Darwin, I had a second interview with Mrs. Darwin. She told me that when Cunningham spoke to her, she had an impression that she was hearing the voice of her husband. But as she was persuaded that Darwin was dead, she thought it must be her own foolish fancy, and so said nothing about it." I nodded, recalling the puzzled look on Ruth's face when she glanced at Cunningham at the inquest, for which I had at the time been unable to account, and while I waited McKelvie's return in the reception room of the Tombs, I pondered upon the kindness of fate in having disposed of the man who had stood so long between me and the one desire of my heart. I wondered how I would tell Ruth the actual facts in the case, and was debating the wisdom of enlightening her when McKelvie returned with a beaming smile. "She'll be here in just a minute," he said, adding quizzically, "You won't need my help in solving this problem, I'll wager," and he waved his hand toward the door. The next moment Ruth was in my arms. End of chapter 39. End of The Mystery of the Hidden Room by Marion HARVEY. This recording by Roger Melin.